the strange career of a Persian royal cupbearer. Imagine yourself in the echoing halls of the Persian court sometime during the reign of the Achaemenid kings, around the 5th century BCE. The empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, a vast network of provinces stitched together by roads, tribute, and royal decrees. Yet, at the center of this mighty machine stood not only kings and generals, but also the quieter figures of court. Among them was the royal cupbearer. His title sounds humble, but in truth, this was one of the most curious and politically charged positions in the palace. A cupbearer's work began with something so ordinary it seems barely worth notice: serving drinks. In the Persian court, wine and water carried significance beyond refreshment. Wine was imported from across the empire, often diluted with water, and presented at banquets as a symbol of shared wealth. But to hand the king his cup was no small matter. The royal drink could easily be poisoned. So, the man who poured it and offered it carried with him not only a jug but also a weight of trust. You can picture the daily scene. At sunrise, the palace was already alive. Servants swept the tiled floors. Guards rotated in the courtyards. Messengers hurried down the long corridors. And somewhere among them, the cupbearer prepared for his duty. He would inspect the vessels, sometimes taste the wine first, and arrange it in ceremonial cups, often of gold or silver, chased with figures of lions or bulls. His hands had to be steady, his manner calm, because in that single gesture of pouring and presenting, the life of the king rested. History gives us a few famous names for this office. In later centuries, in the court of Artaxerxes I, a cupbearer named Nehemiah became known, not only for his duties in Persia but for his later role in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. But for every famous cupbearer, there were many forgotten ones who lived entire lives in service, leaving only faint traces in inscriptions or chronicles. Their days were likely filled with ritual, with the quiet repetition of serving, watching, and waiting. The career of a cupbearer was not entirely menial. In fact, it could be a stepping stone to power. Standing so close to the king, he heard conversations others did not. He saw who entered and who left the chamber. He had access when even generals or satraps were kept at a distance. A misplaced glance, a whispered word, or a pause while pouring the wine could be interpreted as loyalty or suspicion. In a court where plots often simmered, the cupbearer's discretion meant survival. But let us not imagine that his life was all intrigue. Much of it was tedious detail. Records suggest that the Persian court was famous for its banquets, which could stretch late into the night. A cupbearer would need to manage portions carefully. He was expected to know how much wine to offer each guest, when to refill and when to stop. Offering too much was an insult, as if assuming the guest was greedy. Offering too little could be read as stinginess. Balancing these social expectations was part of his craft. At times, he likely served not just wine but also water flavored with herbs, or fermented drinks made from dates or barley in provinces farther east. This reminds us of the reach of the Persian Empire. What was poured into the king's cup might have been grown in the vineyards of Anatolia, shipped over mountains, stored in clay jars sealed with resin, then carried on wagons across the royal road to Susa or Persepolis. Behind the simple act of serving a drink lay a network of agriculture, trade, and taxation. The position demanded physical presence too. Cupbearers were often described as handsome, well-groomed, and dignified in bearing. Their clothing was not gaudy, but it had to be neat. To stand in the king's chamber was to be part of a living display of order. Every robe, every bracelet, every gesture reinforced the image of the king's authority. You can imagine how even silence played a role, for in those long hours of banquets or councils, the cupbearer's quiet presence was itself a message. The king was attended, safe, and served. What might such a man think as he stood beside the throne? Did he dream of power, of one day becoming a satrap himself? Or did he think only of the moment, of pouring carefully and keeping his hands steady? We cannot know, but history gives us glimpses. In later centuries, Greek writers such as Xenophon noted how the Persians trained their young nobles, including in skills of service. To attend the king in any form, even as a cupbearer, was part of a path toward higher responsibility. Still, danger always lingered. If poison ever found its way into the goblet, suspicion would fall first on the cupbearer. Even if innocent, he could be executed. Trust was his shield, but suspicion was always near. Imagine the tension of lifting the vessel each evening, knowing that any tremor in the king's health might bring ruin. That is perhaps why some cupbearers became confidants, turning loyalty into friendship. To be trusted fully was the only true security. The role was ceremonial as well. In some banquets, the cupbearer might pour not only for the king but for honored guests, moving gracefully around the table. In these moments, his role bridged hospitality and diplomacy. A guest treated with care might leave with goodwill toward the king. A guest neglected might leave with insult burning in his memory. Such small actions carried ripples into the politics of empire. Outside the banquet hall, the cupbearer's duties are harder to trace. Perhaps he was involved in managing the royal cellars, where vast stores of wine were kept. These stores were not only for drinking but also for offerings in rituals. Some inscriptions mention wine dedicated to the gods or used in ceremonial libations. A cupbearer may have supervised these rituals, ensuring that the offerings were pure and properly prepared. One wonders how monotonous it became. Day after day, the same pouring, the same careful gestures, the same attention to detail. Yet within that monotony lay the rhythms of empire. The cupbearer was a part of the machinery, as vital in his way as the generals commanding armies or the scribes drafting decrees. Without trust in small acts, the grand structure of power could not stand. Picture again the scene. A great hall in Persepolis, its stone columns rising like forests of carved trunks. The king reclines, courtiers gathered, lamps flickering. At his side stands the cupbearer, golden vessel in hand. He waits, listening for the signal, stepping forward when called. His task is simple, yet all eyes know its weight. And yet, as we close this first glimpse into his life, we might ask, how did a man come to hold such a post? Was he chosen for his family connections, for his loyalty, or for sheer chance? The path from ordinary life in the provinces to the intimate chamber of the king must have been narrow. What steps, what trials, what training led him there? In the previous section, you stood inside the Persian court and watched the cupbearer serve his king. You saw the weight of his task, both ceremonial and dangerous. Now, let us step back and ask how such a man even arrived at this position. Because the career of a cupbearer was not something stumbled upon. It was shaped by layers of education, trust, and a political system that valued loyalty above all else. To understand this path, you must picture the empire itself. The Achaemenid Persian realm was not one kingdom but a patchwork of satrapies, each governed by a satrap who answered to the great king. These satrapies included peoples as diverse as the Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Medes, and Indians. Within each, noble families competed for recognition. A post at court was the highest honor they could hope for, and one of the most intimate posts was that of the royal cupbearer. It is likely that most cupbearers came from noble households. The Persians practiced a system of elite upbringing, where boys of noble birth were educated not only in riding, archery, and spear throwing but also in service and decorum. A youth who showed discipline and composure might be placed in the palace as a page. From there, advancement depended on observation, imitation, and above all, proving trustworthiness. The palace at Persepolis or Susa was a place of constant movement. Delegations arrived from distant lands. Priests prepared rituals. Officials carried tablets of records. Among them, the young attendant learned the delicate choreography of court. He watched how elders bowed, how they spoke, how they stood silently when silence was expected. These were not trivial lessons. To make a mistake in front of the king was not merely embarrassing. It could be fatal. Gradually, a youth might be noticed. Perhaps he was quiet where others were nervous. Perhaps he held his tongue when gossip tempted others. Perhaps he displayed the kind of calm presence that made superiors trust him with small errands. From these errands, a path opened, carrying messages, guarding small treasures, finally, carrying the vessels that held the king's wine. One of the first tasks for a cupbearer in training was learning the ritual of tasting. This was not only symbolic but practical. Poisoning was a fear in all royal courts. And in Persia the risk was especially high because of the vastness of the empire and the number of rivals who might wish the king harm. Before presenting the cup, the servant would sip from it, demonstrating safety. To do this without hesitation, without trembling, required not only courage but also confidence in the supply chain. For if the wine had been tampered with far earlier, even the cupbearer's own sip could be fatal. This danger made loyalty essential. A king might trust his cupbearer more than his general. Generals commanded armies that could rebel. Courtiers plotted with words. But the cupbearer, standing quietly with a vessel, was in a position where betrayal could occur in a single instant. Trust, once established, was like a shield around him. That is why some cupbearers, such as Nehemiah centuries later, could rise to become advisors and diplomats. The role trained a man not only in service but in discretion. Let us not overlook the practical skills. A Persian cupbearer needed to know wines. Persia itself was not the only source of drink. Wines arrived from Lydia, Phoenicia, Egypt, and Greece. Each had different qualities, some sweet, some dry, some strong. Mixing them with water was an art. Too much dilution and the guests would complain. Too little, and drunkenness would offend the dignity of the occasion. The cupbearer needed to understand these ratios instinctively, balancing taste and custom. Archaeological evidence helps us imagine these details. In the ruins of Persepolis, fragments of vessels and records of rations show that wine was distributed not only to nobles but also to workers. Large jars, known as amphorae, carried the liquid across long distances. Seals impressed into the clay stoppers marked their origins. A cupbearer in the palace might trace with his eyes the seals of a shipment, verifying it came from a trusted vineyard. In this way, he was not only a servant but a gatekeeper of quality. His relationship with the king could be strangely intimate. Picture the king reclining at a banquet, speaking with satraps or envoys. The cupbearer stood nearby, silent, attentive. When the king raised his hand slightly, the servant stepped forward. Their eyes may have met briefly as the vessel passed. In that exchange lay a bond, the monarch trusting his life into the servant's hand, the servant presenting loyalty in the act of service. Repeated countless times, it became a rhythm of trust. But what about the man himself? Did he see this as a career or merely as survival? Records suggest that cupbearers could advance. If he earned favor, the king might assign him lands, titles, or greater administrative roles. Some may have risen to become satraps themselves. Others remained in quiet service for decades. Still others may have fallen, dismissed or punished for a single mistake. Imagine the strain of such a life. Every gesture judged, every sip scrutinized. At a banquet, the courtiers might watch not the king but the cupbearer, noting whether his movements betrayed any hint of conspiracy. He had to move like an actor on a stage, every step precise, every glance neutral. The wider court culture amplified this tension. The Persian kings surrounded themselves with grandeur. Gardens watered by canals, halls supported by colossal columns, walls decorated with reliefs of tribute-bearers from distant lands. To serve within such a space was to embody the empire's order. The cupbearer did not merely pour wine. He symbolized harmony and control. We must also consider the religious undertones. Zoroastrian traditions valued purity, especially in food and drink. To defile a vessel or to pollute wine with unclean substances was not only treachery but impiety. A cupbearer, therefore, guarded not just the king's safety but also the ritual sanctity of what was consumed. In this sense, his role bridged the secular and the sacred. There is another layer to explore, the symbolic meaning of the cup itself. Across cultures, sharing drink was a sign of fellowship. In Persia, when the king's cup was poured, it was as if he shared life with his court. The man who facilitated this act was more than a servant. He was a mediator of trust between ruler and ruled. His steady hands kept the performance intact. The irony is that such a figure, so central to daily royal life, rarely left a name behind. We know of Nehemiah only because of his later fame in Jewish history. We know of others only through passing mentions. Most cupbearers were swallowed by anonymity. Their lives, though filled with tension and quiet importance, disappeared into the silence of history. And yet, think of the weight of their unseen influence. A misplaced word to the king, a moment of calm counsel could sway decisions. The cupbearer's nearness meant that he often overheard matters of empire. Perhaps he offered a suggestion. Perhaps he warned the king about a suspicious courtier. Such contributions, though undocumented, might have shaped policies, wars, or alliances. We cannot help but wonder. In an empire of millions, how many destinies turned upon the quiet presence of one man holding a cup? How many crises were prevented because a cupbearer chose loyalty? How many disasters began when that loyalty faltered? You have now followed the Persian royal cupbearer into the banquet hall, watched his careful service, and considered the path that led him there. But our story is not complete without understanding what became of such men when their service ended, and what their presence meant in the larger shape of history. The Persian Empire was vast, but it was also fragile. Its unity depended on trust, ritual, and the symbolic presence of the king as the center of order. The cupbearer, though small in stature compared to generals or satraps, embodied that fragile balance. Let us now step into his later life and legacy. Life beyond the banquet. If a cupbearer served faithfully, he might be rewarded. Inscriptions and fragments suggest that loyal servants could be granted estates, pensions of grain, or positions in provincial administration. This was not charity, but a way for the king to extend his influence. A former cupbearer, now a landowner or minor governor, carried into the provinces the loyalty learned in the palace. He became an echo of the king's authority. Consider the biblical figure Nehemiah, who served as cupbearer to Artaxerxes I. His later mission to rebuild Jerusalem's walls shows how the skills of discretion, diplomacy, and careful judgment translated into administration. He negotiated resources, oversaw labor, and balanced religious and political demands. His authority rested not on military conquest but on the trust once placed in him as cupbearer. His career shows how the role could be a springboard for influence far beyond the wine table. For most cupbearers, however, life likely remained quieter. They might retire to estates provided by the court, living out their days as minor nobles. Some may have continued to serve until death, their lives consumed by repetition. Few names remain to us because they did not leave great deeds behind, but in the rhythm of daily service, they lived lives that mattered to those around them. The cupbearer as a witness. The significance of the cupbearer lies also in what he saw. Imagine the decades of banquets and councils he attended. He would have witnessed satraps presenting tribute, generals discussing campaigns, ambassadors speaking in strange tongues, priests chanting hymns. His ears absorbed the sounds of empire. He may have seen moments of anger, of laughter, of hesitation in the king's face. These details, unnoticed by others, gave him a rare understanding of the monarch's moods. Such insight could be dangerous. To speak of what he had seen might expose him. To remain silent kept him safe but also burdened him with unspoken knowledge. In this sense, the cupbearer's career was not only service but endurance. We might think here of Herodotus, who recorded tales of Persian court life. Though sometimes colored by Greek suspicion, his accounts hint at how central court rituals were to imperial identity. The cupbearer, standing always in the background, was part of the very stage upon which the empire displayed itself. Ritual and fragility. The Persians built Persepolis not only as a capital but as a theater of power. Its great staircases, reliefs, and halls were designed to impress visiting delegations. Every detail mattered. The cupbearer's role was a thread in this tapestry. If the king could drink safely, if his table was orderly, if his court seemed harmonious, then the empire appeared stable. But imagine if this thread snapped. If one day the cupbearer faltered, spilling the wine or worse, betraying trust, the appearance of harmony would crumble. Trust was not an abstract idea. It was embodied in the steady hands of a servant. That is why his role, boring as it seems, was central. We often think of empires as ruled by swords and laws, but here we see that small acts, repeated daily, upheld the entire structure. The empire was as fragile as the cup it held, always at risk of spilling. The quiet influence. The cupbearer's influence extended in ways that are hard to measure. His loyalty reinforced the king's confidence. His presence reassured guests. His discretion kept the palace free from leaks of dangerous gossip. Perhaps he gave a quiet word of counsel at a critical moment, steering the king toward or away from a decision. Some might argue that this was the most boring form of power, unseen, undocumented, subtle. Yet it mattered. Without the quiet loyalty of such figures, the Persian kings could not have ruled such a sprawling, diverse empire. The stability of daily life in distant provinces, the smooth collection of tribute, even the morale of armies depended indirectly on the small circle of trust at the king's side. The end of an era. Eventually, the Achaemenid Empire fell to Alexander of Macedon. In 330 BCE, Persepolis burned. The halls where cupbearers once stood dissolved into ruins. Yet even in Alexander's court, the role of cupbearer persisted, as it had in Assyrian and Babylonian times before Persia, and in later Hellenistic kingdoms after. The idea survived because the need did. Rulers always feared betrayal in their cups. This continuity tells us something about human history. Technologies changed, armies rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, but the basic act of trust at the table endured. The cupbearer remained, century after century, as a symbol of both loyalty and danger. A reflection for you. As you think about the cupbearer's life, consider the quiet weight of his existence. He was not a conqueror, not a philosopher, not a famous king. Yet his life shaped history in small, unseen ways. His story reminds us that history is not only made by great victories or grand inventions. It is also made by the steady, repetitive acts of service, the boring but necessary rituals that hold societies together. Perhaps you pour a drink for someone in your daily life, or perform a task that seems unimportant. The cupbearer's story shows that even such acts can ripple outward, sustaining trust, harmony, and continuity. And yet, we are left with a final question. In those quiet moments, when the banquet hall had emptied, and the lamps flickered low, what did the cupbearer think of his own life? Did he feel pride in his service? Or did he wonder if he had wasted his days holding another man's cup? History does not answer. It leaves us only with silence, and the image of a man standing faithfully beside a throne, steady hands carrying the weight of empire. How Byzantine stable boys maintained the emperor's horses. Step into Constantinople, perhaps around the 10th century, when the Byzantine Empire stood as a crossroads of East and West. The empire had endured for centuries, a living continuation of Rome, but with its own character, rituals, and peculiar routines. Among the many duties that sustained its vast machinery, one of the most unglamorous was also one of the most essential: the care of horses. The Byzantines inherited from Rome not only roads and law, but also the importance of horses in both war and ceremony. Cavalry units such as the cataphracts, heavily armored riders, were central to the empire's military strategy. Horses were also vital for communication, carrying messages across the empire's long roads. And in peacetime, horses played a role in parades, imperial processions, and the famous chariot races in the hippodrome. Behind every imperial display stood boys and young men who worked in the stables. These were not celebrated generals or senators. They were stable hands, often recruited from humble origins, who spent their lives in a world of mud, hay, and hoofbeats. Their daily labor kept the empire's grandeur possible. The setting: Byzantine stables. The imperial stables of Constantinople were located not far from the Great Palace. They held dozens, sometimes hundreds, of horses belonging to the emperor and his household. These were not ordinary beasts. Many were bred from prized lines, imported from Cappadocia, Armenia, or even as far as Arabia. They represented wealth, prestige, and power. Stable boys began their day before dawn. Horses needed care as soon as the first light touched the city's domes. Water troughs had to be checked and hay distributed. Dung had to be shoveled out of stalls. The smell was constant, the labor endless. These were tasks that repeated every morning, regardless of whether the emperor prepared for a grand procession or whether the city lay quiet under rain. But not all stable boys did the same work. Some specialized in grooming, brushing down the coats until they gleamed in torchlight. Others were tasked with feeding, mixing grains carefully measured to keep the animals strong but not restless. A few assisted the trainers, who drilled the horses in marching, pacing, and ceremonial movements. Each boy learned his trade through repetition, often under the stern eyes of older keepers. The routine of care. The horses of the emperor were not allowed to suffer neglect. A Byzantine manual on horsemanship, written by the Emperor Maurice in the 6th century, outlined the importance of keeping cavalry horses in prime condition. The lessons filtered down through generations. Stable boys learned to check hooves daily, removing stones or compacted dirt. They washed wounds with vinegar, wrapped bandages with cloth, and watched for signs of disease. Feeding was an exact science. Horses were given hay, oats, and sometimes beans. Too much grain, and the animals could grow restless or fall ill. Too little, and they weakened. Stable boys had to know the difference, and mistakes were costly. A sick horse could not carry a soldier or parade before the people. Grooming was a daily ritual. Brushes of stiff bristles removed dust, while combs smoothed manes and tails. Some boys polished the harnesses and saddles, ensuring that leather straps were supple and iron fittings shone. When the emperor rode in procession, the horses had to look perfect, their coats gleaming under the sun. The shine of a horse reflected the glory of its master. Watering was another task that sounds simple but carried weight. Horses drank large quantities, and poor water could cause illness. Stable boys often walked to cisterns or fountains to fetch fresh water. Buckets were heavy, and the work repeated throughout the day. To spill, to neglect, or to provide stagnant water was a punishable mistake. Discipline and hierarchy. Life in the stables was not free. The stable boys answered to overseers, often eunuchs appointed within the imperial household. Eunuchs held trusted positions because they were seen as loyal, unable to start dynasties of their own. For the stable boys, this meant strict supervision. A missed chore or a careless mistake could bring harsh discipline. The hierarchy was clear. At the bottom were the youngest boys, tasked with hauling dung and water. Above them were the more experienced hands who groomed and trained. Over all stood the master of the stables, who coordinated supplies, breeding, and training. For him, the boys were tools of labor, replaceable and always under scrutiny. Yet the stables were also a place of opportunity. A boy who showed unusual skill, perhaps calming a nervous horse or noticing a subtle injury others overlooked, could gain favor. That favor might bring better duties, fewer punishments, and, on rare occasions, a chance to rise into the service of cavalry officers or palace guards. Horses in ceremony. The stable boys' work mattered most during imperial ceremonies. When the emperor processed through Constantinople, the horses had to be prepared in flawless condition. They were adorned with embroidered saddlecloths, gilded harnesses, and sometimes even armor. Stable boys worked tirelessly in the days before such events, polishing, feeding, and rehearsing movements. Imagine the scene. The emperor rides out, his retinue following, the crowd cheering along the streets. The horses step in perfect rhythm, their coats gleaming, their manes braided. No one sees the boys who labored for weeks to make this possible, yet their work is everywhere in the spectacle. Even more significant were the races of the hippodrome. Though charioteers received glory, stable workers were the invisible backbone. They fed, trained, and calmed the teams. In the hours before a race, the boys would rub down the horses, whispering to them, steadying them as the roar of the crowd shook the walls outside. The physical toll. Life in the stables was demanding. The boys carried heavy loads, endured the kicks and bites of temperamental animals, and worked in heat and cold. Their hands blistered, their backs ached, and the smell of dung clung to their clothes. Few outsiders envied their labor, and yet, for the empire, their work was essential. A sick horse could mean a delayed message or a weakened cavalry unit. A poorly groomed horse in a procession could tarnish the emperor's dignity. The boys bore these silent burdens, unseen but necessary. Invisible lives. We do not know their names. Chronicles tell us of emperors, generals, and patriarchs, but rarely of the stable boys who kept the machinery of state in motion. They lived and died in anonymity. Perhaps they shared laughter in the stables, sang songs as they worked, or whispered stories of heroes and saints. But history does not record these voices. And yet, by piecing together manuals, chronicles, and archaeological remains of harnesses and stable complexes, we can imagine their daily rhythm. A rhythm of waking before dawn, hauling hay, brushing coats, shoveling dung, carrying buckets, hearing the snorts and stomps of animals, enduring the bark of overseers, and collapsing into sleep only to rise and repeat it again. A question of perspective. It raises a question worth pausing over. Did the boys themselves feel pride in their work? Did they believe they were part of the empire's greatness? Or did they see only the drudgery of endless chores? We cannot know. You have seen the dawn routines of the Byzantine stable boys, the shoveling of dung, the brushing of coats, the long days of anonymous labor. To continue their story, we must step deeper into the world of horses in the empire, for the stables were not only about daily chores. They were part of a larger system that connected warfare, economy, ceremony, and survival. The boys who worked in them lived at the intersection of all these currents, even if they never realized it. The strategic value of horses. The Byzantine military depended heavily on cavalry. From the 6th century onward, the cataphracts became the pride of the empire, heavily armored horsemen, their bodies and steeds clad in metal, charging into enemy ranks like moving fortresses. Horses of this quality were not easily bred or maintained. They needed special diets, constant training, and careful grooming. Behind every cataphract stood not only the rider but a chain of handlers and boys who kept the animals strong. Stable boys often assisted military grooms in preparing these war horses. They learned how to accustom a horse to heavy armor, how to calm it during drills, and how to care for it after long marches. They would rub down sweating flanks, check for sores caused by saddles, and tend to hooves cracked on stony ground. In this way, they were part of the empire's defense, though history never credited them. Think of it this way: a battle could hinge on the endurance of horses. If the cavalry faltered, so might the army. The empire's survival sometimes rested on the care provided by nameless boys in stables, their daily routines hidden behind palace walls or in military camps. Horses and the Byzantine economy. Horses were also an economic burden. They required large amounts of fodder, which had to be transported and stored. The empire organized supply chains to ensure that stables in Constantinople and provincial garrisons had enough oats, hay, and beans. Stable boys often helped unload carts, stack fodder, and measure rations. Records from Byzantine fiscal manuals mention the allocation of grain and hay for horses, showing how carefully resources were managed. The stable boys' work of distribution was not random. It was tied into the empire's economic systems. If they measured carelessly, waste would follow. If they measured too strictly, the animals weakened. Accuracy was demanded, and errors punished. Sometimes the boys themselves may have gone hungry. Grain allocated to horses could not be touched by human hands. The irony of a boy feeding a horse a bucket of oats while he himself ate stale bread cannot be ignored. In the hierarchy of needs, imperial animals often came before imperial servants. Training and ceremonial displays. Stable boys also assisted in training horses for imperial ceremonies. The Byzantine emperor was not only a political ruler but also a symbolic figure, presented before the people in carefully staged rituals. When he processed through Constantinople, the horses had to move in perfect step. This required training, and training required boys who walked alongside, leading, calming, and correcting the animals. Ceremonial horses often wore ornate harnesses, embroidered cloths, and even gilded ornaments. The boys who helped prepare them became invisible artisans of spectacle. They brushed the coats until they shone, braided the manes, and polished fittings until they gleamed. On the day of a parade, they would stand in the background, holding reins, guiding animals, making sure nothing spoiled the display. In such moments, they became part of the performance of power. The crowd might cheer the emperor, but the flawless movement of horses was part of what made the display convincing. A single stumble could mar the ceremony. Thus, the boys' work, though hidden, was woven into the empire's public image. disease and the constant risk. Horses were prone to illness, and in the close quarters of stables, disease could spread quickly. Stable boys were the first line of defense. They watched for changes in appetite, swelling in legs, or labored breathing. With limited medical knowledge, they relied on traditional remedies, washing wounds with vinegar, applying poultices of herbs, or bleeding the animal to balance humors. But such treatments were often as dangerous as the illnesses themselves. A boy might attempt to lance a swelling or apply a heated brand to a wound. If he succeeded, the horse recovered. If he failed, the animal could die and the boy might face punishment. A dead horse was not simply a lost animal. It was a lost investment, a weakened regiment, or a failed ceremony. Disease outbreaks could devastate stables. Entire teams of racehorses might fall ill, disrupting hippodrome contests. Cavalry regiments could lose their mounts before campaigns. In such crises, the lives of stable boys became frantic cycles of care, fear, and exhaustion. The sounds and smells of the stables. To understand their world, you must imagine not only the work but also the environment. The stables were loud with snorts, whinnies, stamping hooves, and the clatter of buckets. They smelled of manure, sweat, hay, and damp wood. Flies buzzed constantly in the summer heat. In winter, the cold air carried the sharp odor of wet straw. Stable boys lived in this sensory world every day. Their clothes absorbed the smell of dung. Their hands grew calloused from brushes and ropes. Their backs ached from carrying water. To outsiders, the palace seemed a place of marble and mosaics. To the boys, it was a place of mud, sweat, and repetition. And yet, perhaps they found comfort in the rhythm. The same chores repeated each day. Horses had to be fed, watered, groomed. The routine offered stability in an empire often shaken by intrigue, invasions, or revolts. While emperors rose and fell, while generals fought and courtiers schemed, the stable boys shoveled dung and carried hay, as they had the day before and would the day after. Social standing and anonymity. Stable boys occupied the lowest rung of palace service. Unlike eunuchs, who could rise to positions of trust, or scribes, who could record their names, the boys remained anonymous. They were seen as laborers, not individuals. Even when they grew older and gained skill, their identities were absorbed into the collective of the stables. They likely came from families too poor to provide other opportunities. Some may have been orphans. Others might have been sons of peasants sent to the city for work. The palace provided food and shelter, but not prestige. For most, the stables were not a path to power but a lifetime of invisible service. And yet, in rare cases, a boy who showed unusual loyalty or ability could catch the eye of a superior. Perhaps he might be transferred to serve cavalry officers, or even become part of the Imperial Guard's support staff. But these were exceptions. For the majority, life was spent among hay and hooves. The question of pride. Did the stable boys feel pride in their work? It is difficult to say. They knew their labor was essential, but they also knew they were not honored. Perhaps some found satisfaction in the health of the animals they cared for. Perhaps others felt resentment, seeing emperors parade on horses they themselves had brushed, while no one noticed their toil. The truth is likely mixed. Human beings seek meaning, even in humble work. The boys may have told themselves they served the empire by serving its animals. You have now walked through the stables of Constantinople, seen the endless labor of stable boys, and traced the larger significance of horses in Byzantine society. In this final section, we will draw the threads together, what these boys' work meant for the empire, what became of them over time, and what their forgotten lives reveal about the foundations of power. Horses as symbols of empire. In Byzantium, horses were never just animals. They were symbols of imperial majesty. When the emperor processed through the streets of Constantinople, the horse beneath him embodied control, order, and divine favor. If the horse stumbled, it seemed an omen. If it appeared strong and beautiful, the emperor's reign appeared blessed. Behind this symbolism were the stable boys. They ensured the horse did not stumble. They polished its coat until it gleamed in the sun. They braided its mane, tightened its harness, and soothed its nerves. The people might cheer the emperor, but without the unseen labor of children in the stables, the illusion of majesty could collapse. This is the paradox of empire. Grandeur rests on menial work. Marble palaces and jeweled crowns dazzled the eye, but they depended on buckets of water carried by anonymous boys. The long continuity of stable work. The Byzantine stable system did not vanish quickly. It endured through dynasties, crises, and even civil wars. As emperors were overthrown, assassinated, or replaced, the stables kept functioning. Horses still needed feeding, races still needed teams, processions still needed mounts. Stable boys lived through these upheavals. Imagine a boy rising before dawn, carrying hay to the stalls, while outside the city rumors swirled of rebellions or invasions. The emperor might change, but the boy's tasks did not. Horses did not care who sat the throne. They needed brushing, watering, and feeding regardless of politics. This continuity gave the boys' work an odd stability. While emperors came and went, while generals rose and fell, their lives were defined by the rhythm of hooves and the smell of hay. Forgotten in the records, Byzantine historians recorded battles, theological debates, and court intrigues. They wrote of emperors, patriarchs, and generals. They rarely, if ever, wrote of stable boys. Their names disappeared into silence. And yet, small traces survive indirectly. Manuals on horsemanship and military training hint at their tasks. Archaeological remains of stables, bits of harness, iron horseshoes, dung pits show their world. Chronicles of the hippodrome races sometimes describe the grooming of horses, though they never name the boys who did it. This anonymity is part of why their story belongs in boring history. It is not the tale of a hero or a battle, but of countless invisible hands whose labor sustained a civilization. Risks and punishments. Stable boys also lived under constant risk. A horse that grew sick, stumbled in a procession, or performed poorly in a race could bring punishment. Overseers held authority to whip or dismiss them. In the palace hierarchy, their word meant nothing against that of a eunuch master or an officer. Sometimes the risks were physical. Horses could kick or bite. A single misstep near an iron-shod hoof could mean broken bones. Illnesses could spread from animals to humans, leaving boys sick with fevers. Work accidents were inevitable, but little mercy was shown. Still, the boys endured, perhaps because they had no choice, perhaps because they found pride in doing their work well. Connections to the hippodrome. The hippodrome was the beating heart of Constantinople's public life. Factions known as the Blues and Greens dominated its races, drawing vast crowds. Stable workers, including boys, played crucial roles behind the scenes. Each racing team had stables, trainers, and grooms. The boys helped feed and calm the chariot horses, guided them to the starting gates, and cared for them after exhausting contests. The roar of the hippodrome may have thrilled them, but they remained shadows, guiding reins in the background while the crowd cheered charioteers. Here, too, their labor mattered more than their names. A victorious team brought glory to its patrons, sometimes even influencing politics. But without the endless care of horses in stables, no victories were possible. The broader picture of Byzantine labor, the story of stable boys, fits into a larger truth. Empires depend on invisible workers. In Byzantium, peasants grew the grain, sailors rowed the ships, servants cleaned the palaces, and boys brushed the horses. These lives rarely appear in chronicles, but without them, the grand narratives collapse. To study these lives is to see empire from the bottom up. The emperor's processions were not miracles of divine order, but human efforts coordinated by countless laborers. The stable boys remind us that history is not only battles and crowns. It is also the repetitive, often dull work of those whose names never survived. What became of them? Few stable boys advanced far. Most lived their lives in anonymity, working until they grew too old or injured, then replaced by new children brought in. Some may have found their way into the cavalry, if they proved strong and skilled enough. Others perhaps drifted back into poverty once dismissed. Occasionally, a boy might rise by fortune or patronage. A eunuch master might notice loyalty and assign him to better duties. A racing faction might reward skill with a permanent place. But these were exceptions. For the majority, life began and ended in the smell of dung and the sound of hooves. Their anonymity is a kind of invisibility in history. Yet, paradoxically, by serving horses that carried emperors, they brushed against greatness without ever sharing in it. A reflection on fragility. As you consider these boys, ask yourself, what made Byzantium endure for centuries? Was it the genius of emperors, the brilliance of generals, or the discipline of soldiers? Partly, but equally, it was the quiet endurance of workers who performed tasks no one celebrated. The empire's grandeur stood on fragile foundations. If the stable boys faltered, if horses grew weak, processions failed, armies slowed, and symbols of power crumbled. Greatness depended on the smallest hands, on forgotten children carrying buckets before dawn. Closing thought. The story of Byzantine stable boys is not exciting. It is not filled with glory or drama. It is filled with repetition, labor, and anonymity. But in that monotony lies the true rhythm of history. Civilizations are not sustained by rare moments of brilliance alone. They are sustained by boring, necessary work done by people whose names vanish into silence. And so we leave the stables with an image. The emperor riding through Constantinople, the crowd cheering, the horses gleaming in the sun. Beside them, hidden from view, a boy holds an empty bucket, sweat running down his face, watching the parade pass by. History records the emperor, but it is the boy who made the moment possible. The long road of Chinese salt caravans in the Tang dynasty. Imagine yourself in Tang dynasty China, sometime in the 8th or 9th century. The empire stretched from the Pacific coast deep into Central Asia, its capital Chang'an bursting with merchants, scholars, monks, and soldiers. The Tang court presided over a world of poetry, invention, and diplomacy. Yet beneath the splendor of its palaces and the beauty of its calligraphy was an older, more stubborn truth. Salt sustained the empire. Salt was not simply a seasoning. It was essential for preserving food, for survival in villages far from fertile land, for soldiers on campaign, and for animals on long journeys. The Tang emperors understood this. They taxed salt heavily, turning it into one of the empire's greatest sources of revenue. That decision set in motion the daily grind of caravans, carrying loads of salt across mountains, deserts, and rivers. Stable images of empire, its bustling markets, its feasts, its armies, were tied to these long, dusty roads. The caravans were slow, monotonous, and perilous. They were led by men and boys whose names we will never know, but whose footsteps and beasts of burden carried the empire's wealth. The origins of the salt monopoly. By the Tang period, salt production had already been part of Chinese life for thousands of years. Coastal salt pans in Shandong and Jiangsu, inland brine wells in Sichuan, and marshes along rivers all produced this vital mineral. What the Tang dynasty did was centralize control. In the 8th century, after the devastating and Lushan rebellion drained the treasury, officials like Liu Yan introduced a salt monopoly. Private trade was banned. Only licensed merchants could transport salt, and taxes were collected at checkpoints. Revenue from this system supplied the state with silver, grain, and military funding. For the caravan drivers, however, this meant stricter oversight. Their loads were inspected, weighed, and taxed. Permits had to be carried. Smuggling salt became a crime punished harshly. So the road was not just long and dusty. It was watched, regulated, and dangerous in more ways than one. The caravan life. Picture a salt caravan leaving Sichuan, where brine wells produced thick blocks of salt. Mules and donkeys were loaded with heavy baskets, each lined with straw and rope. The loads could weigh up to 100 pounds per animal. The drivers, often peasants recruited for wages, walked alongside, guiding the animals with sticks and shouts. The road was slow. 10 to 15 miles a day was considered good progress, especially across rugged terrain. Mountains had to be climbed, rivers crossed on creaking ferries, and bandits avoided. The caravans stretched in long lines, sometimes with dozens of animals, each carrying the white blocks that glistened under the sun. The men rose before dawn. Animals were fed and watered, loads checked, straps tightened. Then the slow march began, feet pounding dust or mud. By evening, the caravan halted near inns or villages. Fires were lit, meals of millet or rice boiled, animals tethered. Salt baskets were stacked and covered to keep off moisture. Sleep was never deep. Someone had to keep watch, for bandits prowled. The white shine of salt was wealth on the road. A single stolen basket meant lost wages, and perhaps punishment from overseers. The smell and weight of salt. To live among caravans was to live with salt itself. Caked clothes and hands. It rubbed into skin, leaving it cracked. It mixed with sweat until men felt their faces burn. Animals too suffered. Raw spots formed where baskets rubbed against flanks. Drivers stuffed straw to ease the pain, but sores were common. The taste of salt lingered constantly. Meals tasted faintly of it. Air carried its tang, and water sometimes grew brackish from dissolving crystals. Caravans carried wealth, but it was heavy, sharp, and unyielding. Inns and checkpoints. On the great roads of the Tang, inns dotted the landscape. These were not comfortable places for common drivers. They were smoky, crowded halls where men spread mats on the floor. Food was plain, millet porridge, pickled vegetables, a cup of tea if fortune allowed. Checkpoints were more intimidating. Officials waited to inspect permits. Salt loads were weighed and taxes demanded. Corruption was common. A caravan master might slip coins into an official's hand to speed passage. Those without money or papers risked confiscation or worse. Stable boys in Constantinople brushed horses for emperors. In Tang China, caravan drivers bent their backs under the empire's need for revenue. Both labors were invisible, but both sustained their worlds. Bandits and dangers. The empire's roads were long, and not all were safe. Bandits haunted mountain passes, waiting to ambush caravans. Stories spread of entire groups disappearing into forests, their animals stolen, their bodies left behind. To guard against this, caravans often hired escorts, sometimes soldiers, sometimes mercenaries. But soldiers could be as harsh as bandits, demanding extra payment for protection. Caravans faced danger whichever way they turned. The open road, the suspicion of officials, the greed of escorts. Storms added to the misery. Heavy rains turned roads to mud, soaking baskets until they grew heavier. In winter, icy winds cut through thin clothes, freezing fingers that held reins. Heat in summer burned through the dust, and animals collapsed in exhaustion. Salt as daily necessity. For the people of Tang China, the salt these caravans carried was not luxury, it was survival. Villagers needed it to preserve vegetables and fish through long winters. Soldiers needed it on campaign. Officials in the capital demanded it for banquets. Monks in monasteries required it to flavor sparse meals. The caravan drivers knew their loads were valuable, yet they themselves lived on the edge of poverty. Their wages barely sustained them. They ate coarse food, slept on mats, and wore patched clothes. The empire grew rich on salt, but those who carried it remained poor. The quiet burden. And so, day after day, the caravans moved. Dust rose behind them. Animals stumbled under weight. Drivers trudged in silence, sweat streaking their faces. Each step was part of an endless cycle. From well to road, from road to checkpoint, from checkpoint to market, from market back to the wells. It was not glorious. It was not remembered in poems or chronicles. Tang poets wrote of moonlight on rivers, of silk garments, of love and loss. They rarely wrote of salt caravans. And yet, without them, markets would empty, soldiers would weaken, and taxes would dry up. A closing question. As you picture the long lines of animals, the weary men guiding them, and the heavy blocks of salt piled high, ask yourself, what did they think as they trudged? Did they see themselves as part of the empire's greatness, or as forgotten figures walking roads that never ended? The salt caravans kept the Tang world alive. But what was life like for the men who bore that weight every day? You have seen the salt caravans leave their wells and pans, trudging across China's roads. You have heard the endless footsteps of men and the steady strain of animals carrying the empire's wealth. To continue their story, we must look deeper into the logistics of the trade, the social lives of the caravan workers, and the tension between state control and private survival. The organization of caravans. The Tang salt trade was not random. Caravans were organized under licenses issued by the state. Merchants purchased the right to transport salt, and then hired laborers and animals to move it. At the top stood the caravan master. He arranged permits, negotiated with officials, and hired escorts when needed. Beneath him worked drivers, peasants, often from poor villages, who sold their strength for wages. Boys might serve as apprentices, learning to pack baskets, lead animals, or cook for the group. The animals themselves were as varied as the regions. In Sichuan, mules and donkeys carried loads along steep mountain roads. In northern plains, oxen pulled carts. In deserts farther west, camels bore the weight, plodding with their slow, steady gait. Each animal shaped the pace of the caravan, and each required different care. The caravan moved as a unit not only for efficiency but for safety. Stragglers risked losing their way or being caught by bandits. The line had rhythm. The shuffle of hooves, the creak of ropes, the clatter of wooden saddles, the calls of drivers urging animals forward. The bureaucracy of salt. Salt was valuable not only as food but as tax. The Tang state depended on it after the Lushan Rebellion, when traditional land taxes collapsed. The salt monopoly became one of the empire's financial lifelines. Caravans moved under constant watch. At checkpoints, officials demanded papers. Loads were measured, and taxes collected. A portion of the salt, or its value in silver, was claimed for the state. This system enriched the treasury, but it placed a heavy burden on those who did the carrying. For the drivers, bureaucracy was both a wall and a maze. A missing paper could mean confiscation. An underweight basket could be accused of smuggling. A late caravan might lose its permit. Corruption made it worse. Officials could invent reasons to delay passage until bribes were paid. The caravan master often bore the brunt of these dealings, but drivers felt the weight. They waited in long lines at checkpoints, animals restless, sweat drying on their backs. They stood silent as officials pried into loads, wrote tallies on bamboo slips, and argued over measures. Hours, sometimes days, were lost to these inspections. The daily lives of drivers. The men who walked the salt roads lived simply. Their clothing was coarse hemp, patched and worn. Straw sandals tore quickly on rocky paths, leaving feet blistered. Hats of woven reeds shielded them from sun and rain. Meals were plain: boiled millet or rice, sometimes with salted vegetables or dried fish. Meat was rare. On long stretches, men chewed hard cakes of grain mixed with salt to sustain them. Water was fetched from streams or wells, often brackish or muddy. At night, they spread mats on the ground or in roadside inns. Fires were built, animals tethered, baskets stacked. Conversation was simple. News from villages, rumors of bandits, complaints about officials. Sometimes they sang work songs, slow and repetitive, to ease the monotony of walking. Sleep was light. Someone always kept watch. The salt was too valuable to leave unguarded. Thieves might sneak into camps. A storm might scatter loads. A sick animal might need tending. Even in rest, responsibility pressed close. Smuggling and resistance. Where there are monopolies, there is smuggling. Not every load of salt traveled on official caravans. Smugglers carried small amounts, hidden in sacks or disguised as other goods. Some bribed officials to look away. Others slipped along side paths, avoiding checkpoints. The state punished smugglers harshly, with confiscation of goods, fines, even execution in severe cases. Yet smuggling persisted because the salt monopoly raised prices high. Villages often needed cheaper salt, and smugglers supplied it. Caravan drivers sometimes walked a thin line. Some carried both official loads and secret stashes, hoping to make extra money. Discovery meant ruin. Success meant survival. It was a gamble taken by men who lived close to poverty. The human cost. Caravan work wore men down. The weight of loads strained shoulders, The miles broke sandals, the dust filled lungs. Animals stumbled and died on roads, their loads redistributed among those that remained. Drivers developed coughs, bad backs, and aching joints. Few grew wealthy from the work. Wages were meager, often eaten up by food costs on the road. A man might labor for weeks, only to return with little more than enough to feed his family. Yet, with few other options, he returned to the salt roads again. The empire's wealth was built on this cycle. Men worn thin by labor, animals used until they collapsed, all for the steady stream of silver and grain that filled the treasury. The broader reach of salt. The salt did not stop at cities. From Chang'an, Luoyang, and Kaifeng, it spread into markets across the empire. Officials bought it for soldiers. Merchants sold it in villages. Housewives used it to pickle cabbage or fish. Monks relied on it in sparse monastery meals. Without caravans, this network collapsed. Markets would empty. Villages would hunger. Armies would falter. The salt roads were not glamorous, but they were arteries of survival. A glimpse of the road. Picture the scene once more. A long line of animals trudging across a mountain pass. The air is thin, the path narrow. Drivers shout and whistle, urging mules forward. Hooves clatter on stone. Baskets sway, ropes creak, sweat drips. Clouds gather, and a cold rain begins to fall. The men hunch their shoulders, sandals slipping on wet rock. Salt baskets grow heavier as they absorb water. One animal stumbles, spilling its load. Others crowd the narrow trail. Drivers scramble to lift baskets, to soothe the frightened beast, to keep the caravan moving. There is no glory in this moment. Only effort. Only the endless weight of necessity. A question left hanging. We have seen the bureaucracy, the routine, the smuggling, the human cost. And yet one question remains. Did the drivers ever imagine the empire they served? Did they see themselves as part of the great Tang world of poets, emperors, and scholars? Or did they only see dust, hunger, and the next mile of road? The salt caravans made Tang prosperity possible. But did those who carried the salt feel part of that prosperity, or forever left outside it? We have followed the salt caravans of Tang China through their long marches, seen the weight of their labor, and glimpsed the bureaucracy that bound them. Now we bring the story to a close, looking at the broader impact of these journeys on empire, the cultural silence around the workers, and the fragile balance they maintained between survival and collapse. The empire's dependence. By the height of the Tang dynasty, the salt monopoly accounted for a vast share of state revenue. Some estimates suggest that as much as half of the empire's income came from salt. This money funded the army, paid officials, and maintained the court at Chang'an. Without the caravans, the empire's finances would have crumbled. The irony is stark. Emperors in jeweled robes, surrounded by scholars and poets, relied on barefoot men trudging through mud with salt baskets. The poetry of Li Bai and Du Fu sang of mountains, rivers, and wine, but none of them wrote of the caravans that made their wine possible. Salt gave flavor, preserved food, and supported armies, yet those who carried it were invisible. This invisibility is itself part of history. Great powers often forget their foundations. The Tang emperors saw themselves as heirs to heaven's mandate, but heaven rested on the bent backs of caravan drivers. The human network. Salt caravans were not isolated. They connected producers, merchants, soldiers, and consumers in a network that tied the empire together. In Sichuan, men hauled brine from wells, boiling it down into solid blocks. Caravans picked up the blocks and trudged across mountain passes. Checkpoints tallied loads and extracted taxes. Markets in cities received the salt, selling it to households and merchants. Villagers used it to preserve food for winter. Soldiers relied on it for endurance on campaign. Each link depended on the others. If the caravans failed, soldiers starved. If soldiers failed, the empire weakened. The slow steps of anonymous drivers thus rippled into the fate of dynasties. Cultural silence. It is striking how little Tang literature mentions caravans. Poets praised wine, feasts, and landscapes, but not the men who delivered salt. Officials wrote edicts on taxation, but not accounts of drivers' lives. History forgot them almost as soon as they lived. Why? Perhaps because their work was considered too ordinary, too dull. Perhaps because elites had little interest in the sweat of peasants. Or perhaps because the monotony of the road left little for the imagination. Yet this silence is telling. It shows us what cultures choose to remember and what they choose to forget. Empires often immortalize their emperors and their poets, but not the laborers who made life possible. Smuggling as resistance. In the shadow of state control, resistance continued. Smugglers moved salt secretly, bypassing checkpoints, hiding crystals in grain sacks, or trading at night in villages. These acts, small and scattered, revealed the tension between the empire's need for revenue and people's need for survival. For some caravan drivers, smuggling was the only way to earn more than starvation wages. It was risky, punishments could be brutal, but desperation made risks unavoidable. In this way, even the most boring labor carried seeds of defiance. The empire's order was never total. It was always balanced on uneasy compromise. The burden of distance. Caravans revealed another truth. The empire was too vast to control easily. Roads stretched for hundreds of miles. Mountains, rivers, and deserts slowed travel. Officials could write decrees in Chang'an, but those decrees reached the provinces only after weeks of travel. In between, caravan drivers carried both salt and news, spreading information as they trudged. The empire's fragility showed here. If floods washed out roads, caravans stalled. If bandits struck, caravans scattered. If soldiers rebelled, caravans stopped altogether. Salt was heavy, slow, and unrelenting. It did not fly across the empire. It crawled. And on its crawl depended the flow of money and power. The individual lives. It is easy to think of caravans as faceless, but they were filled with individuals. A driver from Sichuan might leave his village for months, returning thin and exhausted with meager wages. A boy of 12 might join his father, learning to tie ropes and soothe animals. A widow might rely on a son's caravan wages to buy grain. Each step of the caravan was also a step in countless personal stories. Stories unrecorded, but no less real. The empire saw only loads and permits. The drivers lived hunger, fatigue, and fleeting moments of camaraderie. Imagine one such boy. His sandals are worn, his shoulders ache, but he walks beside his father's mule. At night, he stares at the stars above a mountain pass, wondering if he will always live this way. History never recorded his name, but his feet wore the path that sustained the empire. The broader legacy. The Tang dynasty eventually declined, but the salt monopoly endured. Later dynasties, from Song to Ming to Qing, kept salt under state control. Caravans continued, their labor unchanged. Across centuries, men still bent under the same loads, trudged the same roads, faced the same hardships. This continuity shows how deeply salt shaped China's history. It was not glamorous, but it was constant. Dynasties rose and fell, yet salt caravans remained. They were the quiet spine of empire. Reflection for you. When you think of the Tang dynasty, you might imagine poetry, art, and silk. But remember also the salt caravans. Remember the men who walked dusty miles with heavy baskets, the animals straining under loads, the endless inspections at checkpoints. Their lives were not glorious, but without them, the empire's glory would have withered. Their story leaves us with a thought. Civilizations often depend not on dramatic moments, but on steady, invisible work. A caravan trudging across mountains may seem boring, yet it carried the survival of millions. And so, we close this story with a question. As the drivers walked, step after weary step, did they ever imagine that they carried not just salt, but the weight of an empire? The bureaucratic life of an Ottoman tax collector. Imagine yourself in the Ottoman Empire, perhaps in the 16th century, when the sultans ruled from Istanbul, their reach stretching from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, from North Africa to the Caucasus. The empire's armies were feared, its mosques and palaces admired, its bureaucracy admired for its order. Yet beneath the domes of Hagia Sophia and the spires of the Topkapi Palace, there was another world. the world of officials who spent their lives writing, tallying, and collecting. Among them, the Ottoman tax collector lived a life that was not glorious, not celebrated, but absolutely necessary. Without tax collectors, the empire would have crumbled. Armies needed pay, roads needed repair, mosques required upkeep, and the court in Istanbul devoured revenue. To fund it all, men traveled the provinces with ledgers and authority, knocking on doors, inspecting fields, and recording in painstaking detail what the empire demanded from its subjects. Their lives were bureaucratic, repetitive, and often thankless, but in their careful writing and stern demands lay the foundations of Ottoman power. The structure of taxation. The Ottoman system of taxation was elaborate. It rested on a combination of direct taxes, such as land levies, and indirect taxes, such as customs duties. One of the most significant systems was the timar, land grants given to cavalry officers who collected taxes from peasants in exchange for military service. Alongside this, however, were salaried officials tasked with overseeing revenues in the provinces. Tax collectors, often known as multism under the system of tax farming, were responsible for gathering money, goods, or labor from the population. They did not always own the land themselves. Instead, they purchased the right to collect taxes in a given district for a set period. This meant they advanced money to the state, then traveled to villages to recover it, often with profit. For the ordinary villager, the face of empire was not the sultan in Istanbul, but the local collector who arrived with his ledger. The tools of the trade. What did a tax collector carry? Not weapons, though soldiers often accompanied him, but writing tools. He carried reed pens, ink, and long registers bound in leather. These registers were not random notes. They were carefully maintained documents, listing villages, households, fields, and obligations. In Ottoman bureaucracy, numbers mattered. A collector's work was not simply to demand payment, but to record it properly, to send reports back to provincial governors and ultimately to Istanbul. A missed entry could raise suspicion. A false number could end a career. Accuracy was survival. Yet the work was done not in comfort but on the road. Collectors rode horses or donkeys, traveling from village to village. They stayed in roadside inns or with local notables, writing by lamplight at night. Dust and mud stained their registers. Rain ruined ink. Still, the writing had to be done. Encounters with villagers. To picture their daily life, imagine a collector arriving at a small Anatolian village. The peasants had been warned of his approach. They gathered, nervous, outside the mosque or communal hall. The collector, dressed in modest official robes, opened his ledger. Names were called. Families stepped forward to pay. Some offered coins, others sacks of grain, others livestock. The collector's assistant counted, weighed, and recorded. If someone lacked payment, negotiations began. Perhaps the debt could be delayed, perhaps labor offered instead of money. Sometimes patience was shown, but often firmness prevailed. For the collector, leniency risked his own finances. He had advanced money to secure this post, and he needed to recover it. Behind him stood guards or sipahis, enforcing order. Their presence reminded villagers that refusal was not an option. Yet violence was not always necessary. The collector's power lay in routine, in the certainty that he would return year after year, ledger in hand. The burden of repetition. Much of the work was tedious. Long lists of names, repeated payments, the endless writing of numbers. It was a life of ink stains, aching backs, and weary travel. Collectors worked in cycles, visiting villages season after season, noting changes in population, recording births and deaths, assessing crop yields. Some collectors may have grown numb to it. Others may have found small satisfactions in neat handwriting, in balanced accounts, in the orderly progress of their ledgers. Bureaucracy, after all, rewards the mind that values structure. But the labor was monotonous. Suspicion and risk. Tax collectors lived under suspicion. Villagers hated them for their demands. Governors watched them for dishonesty. The central treasury expected precise numbers. Corruption was common, but it was dangerous. A collector who skimmed too much risked exposure. A collector who was too honest risked earning nothing after expenses. They walked a narrow path. Some became wealthy through careful manipulation of accounts, securing patronage in Istanbul. Others fell into debt, ruined when harvests failed and peasants could not pay. For all their authority, collectors were not secure. Their fortunes rose and fell with the empire's grain harvests and wars. The silent impact. The Ottoman Empire was known for its military strength, its architecture, its cultural richness. Yet its real backbone was the slow, dull labor of officials like these. Without their registers, soldiers would go unpaid, markets would falter, and the court would lose its splendor. The collector's ink was as vital as the soldier's sword. And yet, like the stable boys of Byzantium or the salt drivers of Tang China, their lives are barely remembered. Their names filled registers, but history did not preserve them. Their work was boring, but it sustained an empire for centuries. As you picture the Ottoman tax collector, seated cross-legged in a smoky inn, ink-stained fingers scratching numbers into a ledger, you might ask, did he see himself as a servant of empire, or simply as a man trying to recover his own investment? Was he an agent of the Sultan's will, or merely another trader, turning bureaucracy into profit? The answer lies in the long, gray spaces of history, where power was exercised not through drama, but through the repetitive, grinding work of men with ledgers. You met the Ottoman tax collector at work in villages, ledger in hand, surrounded by anxious peasants and guarded soldiers. You saw his tools, his routines, and his tensions. Now we must look deeper, into the world of bureaucracy that shaped him, the rhythms of travel across the provinces, and the quiet burdens of corruption, accountability, and survival. The machinery of bureaucracy. The Ottoman Empire prided itself on order. Its bureaucratic system was one of the most sophisticated of its age. Tax collectors were not isolated figures. They were part of a chain of authority that stretched from the smallest village to the divan of the Grand Vizier. Every entry a collector wrote in his ledger was echoed upward. Registers were copied and cross-checked. Provincial governors demanded regular reports. The central treasury in Istanbul compiled massive ledgers called defter, recording land, population, and taxes across the empire. These defter were updated constantly, forming a living map of Ottoman wealth. A collector was both small and large. Small because his name might vanish into obscurity. Large because his daily numbers fed the empire's heartbeat. If he failed, soldiers went unpaid, projects stalled, and the chain broke. Life on the road. The collector's life was itinerant. He rarely stayed in one place. His world was inns, dusty roads, ferries across rivers, and endless miles of countryside. He rose before dawn, washed quickly, prayed, and began the day's journey. He rode a horse or mule, followed by assistants carrying registers and supplies. By midday, he might arrive in a village, conduct collections, and rest briefly. By evening, he sought shelter, sometimes in the homes of local notables, sometimes in smoky caravanserais. These inns were not comfortable. They were crowded with merchants, animals, and travelers. The smell of sweat, dung, and cooking fires filled the air. The collector might eat a meal of bread, cheese, and olives, then spend hours writing by lamplight, copying numbers into his ledger. His assistants ground ink, sharpened pens, and checked tallies. Sleep was often uneasy. Coins clinked in his bag, tempting thieves. Villagers resented him. Even his own guards might be untrustworthy. On the road, every night carried a risk. Encounters and negotiations. Each village was different. Some greeted him with wary obedience, handing over coins or sacks of grain. Others pleaded poverty, claiming drought or plague. Some tried to hide wealth, concealing livestock or storing grain in hidden pits. The collector had to decide: press harder, risk revolt, or show leniency and risk his own finances. His decisions were not abstract. He had advanced money to buy this right to collect taxes. If he failed to recover it, he himself fell into debt. Negotiations could be tense. A family might bring forward a young daughter to plead for mercy. A village elder might argue on behalf of his people, offering partial payment. Sometimes deals were struck. Grain accepted instead of coin, labor pledged instead of goods. Other times, soldiers were ordered to seize livestock or to bind men until debts were met. The collector walked a narrow path, too harsh and he risked rebellion, too lenient and he risked ruin. The shadow of corruption. The system of iltism tax farming invited corruption. Collectors often demanded more than the official rate, pocketing the difference. Bribes flowed upward, smoothing reports to governors. Villagers despised this greed, but had little power to resist. Yet corruption was double-edged. If a collector skimmed too much, word might reach Istanbul. Inspectors, known as mufettis, could appear without warning. If fraud was discovered, punishment could be severe. Dismissal, confiscation of property, even execution in extreme cases. The collector lived in constant tension. To profit, he had to bend rules. To survive, he had to avoid bending them too far. The line between clever management and fatal dishonesty was thin. The physical and mental toll. The work wore men down. Long travel strained the body. Endless writing cramped the hand. Arguments with villagers drained the spirit. Suspicion from superiors weighed heavily. Collectors often lived with stomach complaints from irregular food, sore backs from riding, and headaches from smoke-filled inns. Anxiety gnawed constantly. Fear of robbery, of revolt, of bankruptcy. A life of authority was also a life of unease. And yet, for some, this was the only path to advancement. A successful collector could rise, earning enough to buy influence in Istanbul, perhaps securing a more comfortable office. For others, the work ended in obscurity, their ledgers forgotten, their names lost. Villagers' view. To peasants, the collector was not a neutral figure but the embodiment of oppression. His arrival meant parting with grain needed for winter, with coins hoarded for emergencies, with animals vital for survival. They did not see the empire's grand strategy, or the need to fund armies and mosques. They saw only the man with a ledger, taking what they could barely spare. In folktales and village songs, collectors were often painted as greedy or cruel, even if individual men tried to be fair. This hostility added to the collector's isolation. He belonged neither fully to the villagers nor fully to the court. He was a middle figure, hated by the people, distrusted by the state. The silent foundations of power. The empire's armies marched with banners. Its sultans prayed in splendid mosques. Its scholars wrote brilliant works. But behind all this lay the gray, repetitive labor of tax collection. Each coin, each sack of grain, each tally in a ledger sustained the larger system. The collector was like a cog in a great wheel, silent, uncelebrated, easily replaced, but essential. Remove him and the wheel stopped turning. A thought to carry. We have seen the bureaucracy, the journeys, the corruption, and the toil. Yet a question remains. Did these men ever believe in the empire they served? Did they see themselves as part of its glory, or merely as survivors in a system that demanded everything but offered little honor in return? They lived between power and resentment, between ink and suspicion. Their lives remind us that empires are not only built by warriors and rulers, but also by the unseen persistence of men with ledgers. We have followed the Ottoman tax collector through the villages of Anatolia and the Balkans, watched him record payments in smoky inns, and seen how suspicion, corruption, and endless repetition shaped his world. In this final section, we must step back to consider the larger consequences of his work, the hidden influence he carried, and the fragility of the empire resting on his ink-stained hands. The empire's financial spine. The Ottoman state thrived on revenue. Armies of janissaries had to be paid. Naval fleets in the Aegean and Mediterranean required provisions. Bridges, mosques, and caravanserais consumed resources. Even the Sultan's court in Topkapi, with its thousands of servants and artisans, required a constant flow of wealth. The tax collector was one of the empire's main conduits. His ledgers funneled grain, animals, and silver into the state. Without his work, campaigns stalled, the court weakened, and prestige diminished. The Sultan's power was tied not only to battlefield victories, but to the quiet certainty that revenue would arrive each season. This certainty was not natural, It was created by the collector's repetitive labor. His careful writing, his stern demands, his long travels. All these small acts ensured that the empire's backbone remained unbroken. The hidden influence. Though anonymous, the collector carried influence. He shaped the lives of villagers directly. A lenient entry spared a family hardship. A harsh tally forced hunger. His pen could ruin or relieve. He also influenced local politics. Village notables often negotiated with him, offering gifts or favors to protect their communities. Over time, collectors became part of the web of provincial power, mediating between state and subject. Their decisions affected marriages, harvests, and migrations. And yet, this influence was hidden. Chronicles record sultans, viziers, and generals, not collectors. But history at ground level reveals how these men stood at the hinge between empire and village. Their work was dull, but their reach was deep. The cycle of debt. For collectors, the system was risky. To buy the right to collect taxes, they advanced money to the treasury. This created pressure to recover not only what was due, but also enough extra to secure profit. A poor harvest could ruin them. Many fell into debt. Some borrowed from merchants, hoping to survive until the next collection. Others skimmed more aggressively, risking exposure. Still others abandoned their posts, fleeing into obscurity. The system itself encouraged instability. The empire benefited from steady income, but the individuals tasked with gathering it lived on the edge of ruin. They were, in a sense, expendable. The villager's memory. Among villagers, the tax collector lived in memory as a figure of dread. His visits marked the rhythm of rural life. Children may have been hushed when his name was spoken. Songs and stories painted him as greedy, relentless, or cruel. And yet, sometimes villagers may have remembered kindness. A collector who accepted partial payment, who allowed time after a drought, who overlooked a missing coin. Such moments may have softened his reputation. These were small mercies, rarely recorded, but remembered locally. In this way, the collector's humanity flickered through the bureaucracy. He was not only a figure of oppression, he was also a man trapped in the same cycle of survival as the peasants he taxed. The fragility of order. The Ottoman system appeared stable, but it was fragile. If collectors pressed too hard, villages rebelled. If they skimmed too much, the treasury weakened. If harvests failed, both villagers and collectors starved. The balance depended on countless small decisions, season after season. This fragility showed in times of crisis. In war, when armies consumed more resources, collectors were pressured to demand more. Villagers, already strained, sometimes resisted violently. Revolts in the provinces often began with resentment of taxation. The figure of the collector stood at the center of this tension. What history remembers. When we read Ottoman chronicles, we find sultans leading armies, viziers debating strategy, architects building mosques. Rarely do we find mention of collectors. Their names filled ledgers, but the ledgers were stored, copied, and eventually forgotten. And yet, their absence is deceptive. Without them, the empire could not have endured. They were invisible pillars holding up the grand edifice. Their anonymity was not proof of insignificance, but of how societies overlook the foundations of their own power. The reflection of a life. Imagine a collector at the end of his career. His beard is gray, his hands stained with years of ink. He sits in a small house, ledger closed, coins counted. What does he think of his life? Perhaps he remembers endless roads, hostile stares, sleepless nights. Perhaps he regrets the anger he caused. Or perhaps he feels pride, that he served the empire, that he brought order, that he ensured soldiers marched and markets thrived. History gives us no answers. It leaves us only the silence of forgotten names, and the knowledge that every great empire rests on such silent figures. Closing thought. The life of an Ottoman tax collector was not glorious. It was not filled with battles or triumphs. It was filled with numbers, ink, negotiations, suspicion, and repetition. But in those repetitions lay the survival of the empire. His story reminds us that history is not only made by the grand and dramatic. It is also made by the boring, the bureaucratic, and the forgotten. The empire stood not only on swords and mosques, but on the quiet persistence of men with ledgers. So we close this story with a question. When the Sultan sat in Topkapi, hearing poets recite verses and generals report victories, did he ever think of the nameless collector in a smoky inn, scratching numbers into a register by lamplight? Or did he forget, like history has, that his empire's greatness rested on those quiet hands? The forgotten bakers of ancient Rome's grain dole. Picture Rome in the 1st century CE, capital of the empire, its streets crowded with citizens, slaves, merchants, and soldiers. Marble temples gleamed in the sunlight, senators debated in the forum, and the Colosseum echoed with cheers. But beneath this grandeur, Rome's survival rested on something humbler: bread. The Roman state fed hundreds of thousands of citizens with subsidized or free grain through the annona, the grain dole. Without it, riots broke out. With it, peace held. Yet grain alone was not enough. Someone had to grind it, knead it, and bake it into bread. That task fell to the city's bakers, artisans whose names are mostly lost, whose labor filled ovens every night so that Rome could wake to loaves each morning. Their work was monotonous, physically demanding, and often overlooked. But without them, the empire's capital would have collapsed into hunger. The grain dole system. The grain dole had its origins in the late Republic. Politicians like Gaius Gracchus and Julius Caesar used free or subsidized grain to win favor with the people. By the imperial period, the system was formalized. Ships carried vast loads of wheat from Sicily, North Africa, and Egypt into Rome's harbors. From there, the grain was stored, measured, and distributed to eligible citizens. But raw wheat was not useful to most people. It needed to be turned into bread, the staple of Roman diets. Bakeries dotted the city, grinding flour, kneading dough, and feeding ovens day and night. These bakeries formed the quiet backbone of Rome's survival. The bakeries, Roman bakeries, were not glamorous. Excavations in Pompeii, preserved by Vesuvius, give us glimpses of their world. They were dim, smoky rooms filled with grinding stones, wooden troughs, and large brick ovens shaped like domes. Floors were dusty with flour. Air was thick with heat. Mills were powered by donkeys or slaves, who pushed heavy stone wheels in circles to grind grain. Flour collected in bins, where workers mixed it with water and sometimes sourdough starter. Teams of bakers kneaded the dough in long troughs, their arms and backs straining. The dough was then shaped into round loaves, scored with cuts, and slid into ovens with long paddles. Heat was intense. Ovens burned wood, creating stifling air that left bakers drenched in sweat. Work often began before dawn and continued late into the night. Bakers slept little, their lives tied to the rhythm of bread. The daily routine. A baker's day was repetitive. At night, workers prepared flour and dough. Before sunrise, ovens roared with fire. Loaves baked for the morning crowds. By midday, fresh bread was sold in markets or distributed through the dole. Afternoon meant cleaning, repairing equipment, preparing dough for the next cycle. By evening, the cycle repeated. Sleep came in short snatches. Hands cracked from flour and heat. Muscles ached from kneading. Clothes smelled of smoke and yeast. It was not a glamorous life, yet bakers kept Rome fed. Bread for the masses. The bread produced was not fine white loaves but coarse, dark rounds. It was filling, not delicate. Loaves often had stamps impressed on them, marking the bakery of origin or the official overseeing the dole. This stamping ensured accountability. If bread was missing or short in weight, blame could be traced. For the poor, this bread was survival. For the state, it was politics. A well-fed population was less likely to riot. Emperors knew that as long as grain and bread flowed, their rule was secure. The saying "bread and circuses" captured this truth. Entertainment distracted, but bread sustained. The workers themselves. Who were the bakers? Many were freedmen or slaves. Freed slaves often ran bakeries, hiring workers or buying slaves to assist. Some bakeries were family businesses, with wives and children helping in smaller tasks. Their status was modest. Bakers were not celebrated like senators or generals. They did not leave monuments of conquest, but occasionally they left tombstones showing round loaves carved in stone, a reminder of their trade, their pride in it, and its importance. The smell and the sound. Life in the bakeries was filled with sound and smell. Grinding stones groaned. Donkeys brayed as they pushed wheels. Workers shouted above the noise. Ovens roared with heat. The smell was heavy. Smoke, yeast, sweat, and bread mingled in the air. For Romans walking past, the scent of fresh loaves was familiar, a signal of daily stability. For bakers inside, it was constant, clinging to their clothes, their hair, their skin. Risks and punishments. Bakers lived under scrutiny. Bread shortages brought anger. If loaves were light or distribution delayed, crowds grew restless. Riots could erupt quickly in Rome, and bakers were often caught in the middle. Officials monitored weights carefully. Fraud, using less flour, watering dough, or stealing from state supplies, was punished harshly. Bakers who cheated risked fines, exile, or worse. The state could not tolerate disruption of the grain dole. This constant pressure shaped their lives. They worked not only against heat and exhaustion, but also against fear of punishment. So here we see them. Men and women bent over troughs, covered in flour, feeding ovens that never cooled. They were not remembered in chronicles. Yet without them, Rome itself would have starved. But a question lingers. Did they see themselves as servants of empire, or merely as exhausted workers surviving one loaf at a time? Their story reminds us that Rome's greatness was not marble temples or gladiatorial games, but the daily bread baked in smoky rooms by forgotten hands. You entered the smoky bakeries of Rome, where flour dust clung to every surface and men and women bent over troughs of dough, feeding ovens that burned all night. You saw how the grain dole kept Rome alive and how bakers stood at the invisible center of that system. Now we move deeper into the logistics of the dole, the lives of bakers within Roman society, and the constant tension between abundance and shortage. The flow of grain. To understand the baker's lives, you must first follow the path of the grain. Rome could not feed itself from local fields alone. Its population, often near 1 million in the early empire, consumed far more than the countryside around Latium could provide. The empire solved this by drawing on its provinces. Sicily, Egypt, and North Africa were the granaries of Rome. Ships sailed with their holds full of wheat, braving storms and pirates, bound for Ostia, Rome's port. From Ostia, barges carried the grain up the Tiber, unloading it into warehouses called Horia. From these vast stores, officials distributed grain to citizens eligible for the dole. Some families collected raw wheat, but most relied on bakeries to grind and bake it. The bakeries stood between state warehouses and household tables, turning grain into edible bread. The structure of the grain dole. The grain dole was carefully organized. Records list the number of recipients, sometimes as high as 150,000 adult males in the city. Each month, citizens received a ration, enough to sustain a family. This meant a staggering volume of flour had to be processed daily. Bakeries churned out thousands of loaves each day, a task requiring endless labor. For the workers, there was no day off. Bread had to be made, regardless of festivals, weather, or illness. Supervision was strict. Officials weighed loaves, inspected ovens, and stamped bread with marks of accountability. The state understood that bread shortages meant unrest. A missed shipment from Egypt or a broken chain of distribution could trigger riots in the Forum. The baker's place in society. Bakers were not honored elites, but they were visible. Markets bustled with their trade, and their ovens sent smoke curling into the air above city blocks. Everyone needed bread. A senator's slave and a street beggar both ate loaves baked by the same calloused hands. Some bakers grew modestly wealthy, especially those contracted by the state. They hired slaves or apprentices to run larger operations. Tombstones found in Rome show bakers depicted with round loaves or ovens, suggesting they took pride in their trade. Still, their reputation was mixed. Some Romans looked down on them as mere tradesmen, sweaty and flour-covered, too tied to labor to join the elite. Yet their indispensability gave them a kind of quiet authority. If bread stopped, even the emperor trembled. Inside the bakery, to step into a bakery was to step into a storm of activity. Donkeys trudged in circles, grinding grain between heavy stones. Slaves shoveled flour, coughing as dust filled their throats. Bakers mixed dough in troughs, kneading with arms that ached from repetition. The oven blazed, its heat suffocating, its roar constant. The work was divided carefully. Grinders, kneaders, shapers, bakers, sellers. Each person had a role, and mistakes slowed the cycle. Dough had to rise properly, loaves had to bake evenly, orders had to be filled. The rhythm was endless. By the time one batch cooled, another was ready for the oven. By the time bread was sold in the forum, more flour was being ground. Day merged into night in cycles of flour, heat, and exhaustion. Bread and politics. Bread was never just food in Rome. It was politics. The dole kept citizens quiet. Emperors who ensured full warehouses gained loyalty. Emperors who failed saw riots. Bakers, though not rulers, felt this pressure directly. If a shipment was late, if loaves were short, the anger of crowds fell first on them. Shops could be looted. Bakers could be beaten. Their lives were tied to forces far beyond their control. Storms in the Mediterranean, bad harvests in Egypt, corruption among officials. Yet the people saw only the baker who failed to provide. Thus, the bakers lived in constant anxiety. Success meant obscurity. Failure meant danger, fraud, and punishment. Some bakers tried to profit from their position. A loaf could be made lighter by adding less flour or more water. Weights could be rigged, but Roman officials monitored closely. Fraud risked harsh punishment, fines, confiscation, even exile. Stories circulated of bakers caught cheating. Their ovens were destroyed, their names disgraced. In a city where bread meant survival, the state allowed little leniency. This scrutiny added to the tedium of the job. Every loaf had to be exact, every weight correct. Precision mattered as much as speed. The human toll, the physical toll of bakery work was immense. Heat from ovens blistered skin. Flour dust irritated lungs. Backs bent from lifting sacks of grain. Kneading dough for hours left arms sore and swollen. Accidents were common. Burns from ovens, cuts from grinding stones, and crushed fingers under heavy sacks all left scars. Slaves bore the worst of it, working until their bodies gave out. Freedmen and owners fared better but shared in the exhaustion. Despite this, bread-making never stopped. If one worker collapsed, another took his place. Rome's hunger did not wait. The smell of stability. To ordinary Romans, the smell of baking bread drifting through streets meant security. It meant the dole was working, that the empire was feeding its people. It was a smell of peace. But for the bakers themselves, that smell meant another day of labor. Another day of sweat, dust, and endless repetition. The same scent that comforted the city reminded them of their own fatigue. We have seen the flow of grain, the rhythm of the bakeries, the politics of loaves, and the toll on bodies. Yet we are left with a question. Did the bakers ever feel pride, that they sustained an empire through bread, or did they see only endless ovens, never-ending dough, and the knowledge that their names would vanish even as their loaves fed millions? Their silence in history leaves us guessing. But the bread they baked each day remains one of the strongest symbols of Rome's endurance. We have entered the bakeries of Rome, seen the flour dust on the floor, the donkeys grinding grain, the heat of ovens, and the endless cycle of kneading and baking. We have traced the flow of grain from Egypt and North Africa to Rome's markets, watched how politics depended on bread, and felt the strain of bakers' bodies under relentless labor. Now we must close their story by examining their hidden influence, the fragility of the system they sustained, and the quiet legacy of their forgotten hands. Bread as empire. The Roman Empire was built on conquest, roads, and law, but its capital was built on bread. The city's population, perhaps close to 1 million, was too large to survive without imported grain. A bad harvest in Egypt or storms on the Mediterranean could threaten hunger in Rome itself. Bakers were the last link in this chain. Grain stored in massive horia warehouses was useless until it passed through mills and ovens. Without bakers, Rome's greatest symbol, the free distribution of bread, would have been meaningless. Their labor made politics possible. Emperors promised bread to maintain loyalty. Senators debated distributions. Crowds rioted when loaves ran short. But the men who sweated over dough and stoked ovens were invisible in those decisions. Their work gave form to imperial promises. The forgotten workforce. Who were these bakers? Archaeology, inscriptions, and legal texts give us glimpses. Many were freedmen, once slaves who had gained liberty but stayed tied to their trade. Others were still enslaved, working in large bakeries owned by wealthy patrons. Bakeries like the one in Pompeii show dozens of workers toiling together. Some grinding, some kneading, some shaping loaves. The division of labor suggests hierarchy. Owners or managers oversaw, slaves and poor free men labored. Women and children may have assisted with smaller tasks, such as cleaning, carrying water, or selling loaves in markets. Despite their numbers, history rarely recorded their names. A few left tombs shaped like ovens or decorated with carved loaves, proud enough to mark their identity. But most vanished into anonymity. The fragility of the system. The grain dole gave Rome stability, but it was fragile. A missed shipment from Alexandria could empty warehouses. Fire in a bakery district could halt bread supply. Corruption among officials could misdirect grain. When shortages struck, crowds rioted. The people did not attack ships in distant harbors. They attacked bakeries and warehouses. Bakers bore the brunt of urban rage. Their shops could be looted, their families threatened, their livelihoods destroyed. Thus, their lives balanced on uncertainty. On good days, they worked in anonymity. On bad days, they became targets of anger. Rome's peace depended on them, yet Rome offered them little protection. Bread and identity. Bread was more than food in Rome, it was identity. To be a Roman citizen meant to be entitled to the dole. Foreigners, slaves, and women were excluded. The daily distribution marked the boundary of belonging. Bakers stood at the center of this identity. By producing bread for the dole, they reinforced what it meant to be Roman. Their ovens shaped not only loaves but citizenship itself. And yet, the bakers themselves were often outsiders, freedmen, slaves, immigrants. They provided the symbol of Roman identity while standing at its margins. This irony deepens their invisibility. The daily burden. To return to the bakery. Imagine one baker in his 30s, shoulders broad from years of kneading, hands scarred from burns. He wakes in darkness, enters the workshop, and feels the oven's heat on his face. He works through the night, kneading dough, sliding loaves, wiping sweat from his eyes. By dawn, carts carry bread to markets and distribution points. He eats a crust of his own bread, sits briefly, then begins again. His children may never inherit wealth, only the same labor. His name will not survive, but his bread will feed thousands that day. Multiply him by hundreds, and you see the hidden foundation of Rome. What remained? When Pompeii was buried by Vesuvius in 79 CE, bakers' ovens froze in time. Dozens of loaves were found carbonized in one bakery, their round shapes still intact, stamped with marks. These loaves are among the most vivid relics of daily Roman life. Not statues or marble, but food meant for ordinary people. Those loaves remind us of the baker's work. They remind us that history is not only emperors and wars, but also men covered in flour, sweating in smoky rooms, feeding ovens so that the city could live. Reflection for you. The bakers of Rome's grain dole were forgotten in chronicles, overlooked in poetry, and absent from monuments. Yet they sustained the empire's capital, day after day, loaf after loaf. Their lives were repetitive, harsh, and largely invisible. But without them, Rome's promise of bread and circuses would have collapsed into hunger and revolt. Their story leaves us with a thought. Perhaps the true strength of empires lies not in their armies or monuments, but in their bakers, their stable boys, their tax collectors, the ones whose boring, endless labor kept the system alive. And so we ask, when Romans cheered in the Colosseum, did they ever think of the men in smoky ovens, kneading dough through the night? Or, like history itself, did they forget the very hands that fed them? What a day looked like for a medieval Icelandic law speaker. Travel with me now to Iceland in the Middle Ages, a land of long winters, short summers, and scattered farmsteads clinging to valleys and coasts. The population was small, the land rugged, and yet Iceland developed one of the most unusual legal traditions in Europe. Without kings or castles, the island governed itself through assemblies called things, where disputes were settled, laws recited, and agreements forged. At the center of this system stood the Lgskummer, the law speaker. His title sounds dramatic, but his work was mostly memory, patience, and repetition. The law speaker did not command armies or build palaces. He spoke the law quite literally from memory, for in Iceland's early centuries, law was not written but carried in the human voice. He was a living archive, a walking code, a man whose daily life mixed dull recitations with subtle influence. The setting, Iceland's assemblies. Each summer, Icelanders gathered at the Althing, a great open-air assembly held at Thingvellir. Families traveled for days across lava fields and rivers, camping in temporary booths. Farmers, chieftains, merchants, and free men came together to trade, feast, argue, and settle disputes. At the center of the Althing was the Lagberg, the low rock. Here, the law speaker stood before the crowd. His duty was to recite portions of the law each session, ensuring that the community remembered its codes. He also announced decisions, confirmed agreements, and guided procedure. But the Althing was only a brief period each year. For most of the time, the law speaker lived quietly on his farm, tending animals and land like other Icelanders. His special role emerged only at assemblies, where memory became law. The burden of memory. In a world without printing presses or widespread writing, the law speaker's memory was the archive of the island. He was expected to recite the law in 3-year cycles, covering 1/3 of the code each summer. This meant hours of chanting rules aloud. Rules about inheritance, property, marriage, homicide, and fines. The task was repetitive. Imagine standing on a rock, repeating clause after clause in a steady voice, while farmers shifted on their feet. The audience was not always attentive, but the act itself gave authority. By hearing the law spoken, the community affirmed it. For the law speaker, this was not performance but discipline. He had to memorize thousands of words, keep them precise, and recall them under pressure. A mistake could bring dispute, for rivals might accuse him of altering tradition. His credibility depended on accuracy. Daily life at home. Outside the Althing, the law speaker lived like other farmers. He rose early, tended sheep and cattle, checked fences, supervised haymaking in summer. He sat by the fire in winter, repairing tools, telling stories, and repeating lines of law to keep them fresh in his mind. His house was a turf dwelling, walls thick with sod, smoke drifting from the hearth hole. His family shared the chores. Meals were plain, dried fish, skyr, bread, and sometimes meat. The law speaker's life was not luxurious. His prestige came from his role, not from wealth or grandeur. Yet even at home, people sought him out. Neighbors came with disputes, questions of boundary stones, inheritance claims, or debts. He offered advice not as a judge, but as a man who remembered what the law required. In this way, his farm was part household, part office, part memory vault. Neutral, yet not neutral. The law speaker was meant to be impartial. He did not enforce law or punish criminals. He only recited. But neutrality was difficult. He was often drawn into disputes, asked to clarify points, pressured to interpret phrases. His words could tilt outcomes. Some law speakers became powerful by guiding assemblies, aligning with chieftains, or shaping how law was understood. Others kept quiet, preferring safety in neutrality. The balance was delicate. Speak too boldly, and enemies multiplied. Speak too little, and authority weakened. The slow rhythm of assemblies. At the Althing, time moved slowly. Cases were brought forward, witnesses called, speeches made. The law speaker stood to confirm procedure, ensuring that rules were followed. His role was less about drama than about process. Imagine him calling out names, declaring fines, reciting oaths. He spoke in a measured tone, keeping the assembly orderly. For hours each day he repeated formulas, clauses, and procedures. The rhythm was steady, almost boring, yet vital. Without his voice, the assembly had no anchor. His place in society. The law speaker was chosen by the chieftains, serving a fixed term. His position gave prestige but also risk. He could be blamed for disputes, accused of bias, or even challenged if his memory faltered. Some law speakers became legendary. Snorri Sturluson, the great saga writer of the 13th century, once held the role. But most were forgotten, their names preserved only in lists. They lived quietly, remembered briefly, then replaced by others who carried the same burden of memory. The human side. Picture the man himself. His voice hoarse from hours of reciting. His hands rough from farming. His mind crowded with rules about sheep trespassing, marriage contracts, and blood payments. At night, he lay by the hearth, repeating lines in his head, making sure memory did not slip. His children may have listened, learning bits of law without meaning to. His wife may have sighed at the endless mutterings. But he carried on because the community depended on his memory. He was not a warrior or a priest. He was a reciter, and that was enough to hold Iceland together. So here we see him, a man whose daily life mixed farming chores with endless recitations, whose voice carried the law of an island, whose name might never be remembered beyond his term. But a question lingers. Did he see himself as a servant of justice, or simply as a tired farmer who happened to memorize rules? Was he proud of being the voice of law, or weary of the burden of repetition? History leaves us uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of his story. You have seen the law speaker at the Althing, standing on the low rock, voice steady as he recited the codes of Iceland, and you have walked with him on his farm, where memory and chores shared his time. Now let us move further into his world. His interactions with chieftains, the texture of the Althing itself, and the pressures of holding in his head the fragile thread of Iceland's unwritten law. The Althing as a stage. The Althing was not only a legal gathering but also a social event. Every summer, families pitched their booths of turf and cloth at Thingvellir, creating a temporary town on the lava plain. Merchants sold goods, farmers bartered livestock, poets recited verses, and marriages were arranged. Amid this bustle, the law speaker held a unique place. He was not a ruler, but all eyes turned when he climbed the low rock. From that natural platform, he raised his voice over the crowd, the sound carrying across the open plain. In that moment, law became performance. The law speaker's words gave structure to the assembly. Without him, the Althing was chatter and argument. With him, it became order. Each day, he declared what portion of law was to be recited, what procedures followed, which cases were valid. The pressure of memory. The law speaker's authority rested entirely on memory. He was expected to know every clause of the law book, to recite them without hesitation. Icelandic law, preserved later in the text known as Grágis, covered property rights, inheritance, blood feuds, marriage, and trade. It was vast and detailed. Imagine the pressure. Standing before hundreds of listeners, many of them chieftains eager to catch mistakes. If his words slipped, rivals might accuse him of altering the law. A stumble could undermine his authority. To prepare, law speakers rehearsed constantly. They recited clauses aloud in solitude, repeated them by the fire in winter, tested their memory with apprentices. Some may have trained their sons or trusted companions, creating a living chain of recall. Memory was discipline, and discipline was survival. The chieftain's influence. Though chosen by the community of chieftains, the law speaker was never entirely free. Powerful men pressed him to interpret laws in ways favorable to them. They might invite him to feasts, offer gifts, or threaten isolation. The law speaker had to balance carefully. Too much favor to one chieftain invited resentment from others. Too much neutrality risked losing protection. He walked a narrow path, using measured words to avoid enemies while maintaining respect. This balancing act made him less a judge and more a mediator. His role was to keep the fragile consensus of Iceland's assembly intact, smoothing conflicts with recited tradition rather than open confrontation. The sound of the Althing. What did the Althing sound like? Voices shouting across booths, livestock bleating, merchants hawking wares. Amid this din, the law speaker's steady recitation was like a heartbeat. Witnesses swore oaths, repeating formulas. Plaintiffs argued their cases. Defendants denied them. The law speaker confirmed whether procedure was followed. His role was not drama but rhythm, ensuring each step was carried out properly. This rhythm was slow. A single case could drag across days. Listeners grew restless, distracted. Yet the law speaker endured, repeating words patiently. His calm steadiness was the anchor of the assembly. Disputes and blood feuds. Much of the Althing's business concerned disputes over land, livestock, or inheritance. But the most serious were blood feuds. In Iceland's honor-based society, killings often sparked cycles of revenge. The law provided a way to channel these into fines or settlements. The law speaker's recitations guided these cases. He reminded listeners of compensation rates, of who could speak as witnesses, of deadlines for filing claims. His memory allowed violence to be redirected into law. Without him, disputes might have spiraled unchecked. In this sense, his work was boring but life-saving. By repeating formulas, he reduced bloodshed. His words carried not just law but peace. His daily burden at the Althing. During the weeks of the assembly, the law speaker's days were long. At dawn, he rose in his booth, perhaps eating bread and butter, perhaps salted fish. By mid-morning, he stood at the low rock, reciting passages, guiding procedures. In the afternoon, he moved between cases, advising, clarifying, listening to chieftains press their interpretations. At night, he returned to his booth, weary, voice hoarse, repeating in his head the passages he would recite the next day. Sleep came late, disturbed by the hum of voices outside and the weight of memory inside. This cycle lasted until the assembly closed. Then he returned home, back to farming. The sudden shift must have felt strange, from being the voice of law before hundreds to being a farmer mending fences alone. The human limits. Though revered, the law speaker was human. He grew tired, forgot lines, grew old. Memory faltered with age. Some law speakers resigned when they could no longer keep the code in their minds. Others clung on, their authority slowly eroded by mistakes. Succession mattered. A new law speaker had to prove his memory. Communities debated candidates, weighing loyalty and skill. To choose poorly risked chaos, for if the law's memory weakened, so did the assembly's authority. The dullness and the depth. It is easy to see this role as dull. Endless recitations, monotonous clauses, careful formulas. But in that dullness lay depth. The law speaker embodied continuity. Each time he recited, he tied the present to the past. His voice carried tradition across generations. And yet, he may have felt weary. Did he mutter lines to himself while tending sheep, wishing he could forget? Did he dream of silence, free from memory? Or did he take pride, seeing himself as the living archive of his people? We have seen the law speaker at the Althing, surrounded by chieftains and crowds, carrying the burden of memory, guiding disputes with calm repetition. He was respected, but also pressured, caught between neutrality and influence. But what of his inner life? Did he believe in the justice of the laws he recited, or did he simply see them as words to be repeated? Was he a believer in order, or merely a voice for tradition? History does not tell us. It leaves us with the image of a man standing on a rock, speaking words he did not write, holding in his voice the fragile peace of an island. We have seen the law speaker at the Althing, voice steady as he recited unwritten codes, and on his farm, muttering rules by the fire while tending sheep and mending fences. We have traced how memory became law, how neutrality was fragile, and how influence pressed upon him from powerful chieftains. Now let us close his story, looking at the wider significance of his role, the fragility of Iceland's law system, and the quiet legacy of a man remembered more for his voice than for his deeds. The Althing as community memory. The law speaker was not merely one man. He was the embodiment of collective memory. In a society without kings, parliaments, or written statutes for much of its early history, the community depended on the spoken word. By reciting the law in 3-year cycles, he ensured continuity. Each repetition was a renewal of identity. When he stood on the low rock and chanted rules about inheritance, marriage, or blood fines, he reminded the people not only of obligations but of who they were as a community. The law was not abstract, it was spoken aloud, and in that speaking it became real. His voice, calm and repetitive, kept Iceland's fragile order intact. In a land of scattered farms, harsh weather, and long distances, the spoken word tied people together. The limits of authority. The law speaker had authority, but it was narrow. He could declare the law, but he could not enforce it. Enforcement belonged to chieftains and their followers. If a man refused to pay fines, if blood feuds reignited, the law speaker had no power to compel. He was a guide, not a commander. This limitation shaped his life. He stood at the center of assemblies, but his power was symbolic. He was respected for memory, not for might. His strength was patience, not force. And yet, this limitation was also protection. He could recite without bearing the direct blame for enforcement. He carried law in his voice, but not blood on his hands. Law as oral tradition. The law speaker's role reveals the fragility of oral tradition. So long as memory held, the system worked. But what if memory faltered? What if 2 men remembered differently? Disputes could arise, not only over law itself, but over its recitation. This fragility eventually led to the writing down of laws in the 12th and 13th centuries, producing texts like Gragas. Once written, the role of the law speaker shifted. He still presided, but his burden of memory lessened. The written word replaced the living archive. For centuries, however, the island trusted one man's memory. That trust, repeated generation after generation, is both astonishing and precarious. The law speaker at home. Back at his farm, the law speaker lived simply. His prestige did not make him wealthy. He rose at dawn to milk cows, cut hay, or mend tools. In winter, he sat by the hearth, woolen cloak around his shoulders, whispering laws to himself as snow drifted outside. Visitors came with disputes, neighbors arguing over grazing land, relatives quarreling over inheritance. He listened, recited rules, and offered clarity. He was not judge or jury, but his words carried weight. Even at home, law was never far from him. His children may have found his mutterings dull, his wife weary of endless recitations, but they lived with the knowledge that their household was part of Iceland's fragile governance. The human burden. We must not forget the human cost of this role. To carry thousands of lines of law in one's head, year after year, was exhausting. The pressure of reciting before chieftains, the fear of mistakes, the endless repetition, these wore on the mind. Some law speakers must have grown weary, longing for silence. Others may have taken pride, seeing themselves as guardians of order. Perhaps both feelings lived together. Pride and fatigue, authority and burden. The law speaker's life was both boring and monumental. Boring because it was endless repetition. Monumental because repetition sustained a society. The fragility of Icelandic order. Iceland's system was always fragile. Without kings or armies, peace depended on consensus. The law speaker's role symbolized that consensus. His voice declared rules, but the community enforced them only if it agreed. When consensus broke, as it did in the violent 13th century, the age of the Sturlungs, the system faltered. Blood feuds escalated, assemblies weakened, and Iceland eventually fell under Norwegian rule. The law speaker's voice could not hold back that tide. And yet, for centuries, his voice had been enough. That endurance, in so harsh and isolated a land, remains remarkable. Legacy and reflection. Few law speakers are remembered by name. Snorri Sturluson is famous, but for his sagas, not his tenure. Most law speakers lived, recited, and vanished from history. Their legacy is not in individual deeds, but in the continuity of the office itself. Their story is a reminder that law is not always written in stone. Sometimes it lives in voices, in memory, in repetition. Sometimes history is held not in monuments, but in the mind of one farmer reciting lines by firelight. Closing thought. The law speaker of medieval Iceland was not a ruler, not a warrior, not a poet. He was a man who repeated rules year after year, so that a small community in the North Atlantic could live together without kings. His story leaves us with a question. Is greatness measured in dramatic deeds, or in the quiet endurance of memory? When he stood on the low rock, voice steady against the wind, did he know that his boring labor was the thread holding an entire society together? Perhaps he did, or perhaps he only saw himself as a farmer who could not forget. The accountants of the Inca empires, not records. High in the Andes, before European contact, the Inca Empire ruled over millions of people, stretching from modern Ecuador down through Peru, Bolivia, and into Chile and Argentina. With mountains, deserts, and valleys spread across such vast distances, ruling this empire required organization on a scale that seems impossible without writing. And yet, the Inca did it. They did not use alphabetic scripts. They did not carve law codes on stone tablets like Mesopotamia or scratch scrolls of papyrus like Egypt. Instead, they relied on cords and knots. These were the quipus, bundles of strings tied in careful patterns, each knot and each position representing numbers, categories, and information. Behind these cords stood the Quipucamayaks, the knot keepers, who were the accountants of the Inca world. Their lives were spent memorizing, tying, untying, checking, and carrying cords. They were not warriors or emperors. They were men who worked with their hands and minds to ensure that grain, labor, and taxes flowed smoothly through the empire. The world of the Quipicamayak. The Quipicamayak held a specialized role. They were trained in interpreting and tying knots, a skill that combined mathematics with memory. Each cord was made of spun cotton or camelid fiber, dyed in different colors. Knots tied at varying positions represented numbers in a decimal system, units, tens, hundreds, and so on. The cords hung from a main strand, like the fringe of a tapestry. Some represented census data, others stored tribute amounts, others recorded storehouse inventories. A quipu could contain more information than a casual I might guess, and only the trained knot keeper could read it. These men were scattered across the empire, each responsible for local data. At harvest, they recorded the amount of maize or potatoes stored. When labor was organized for road building or terrace farming, they recorded the number of men mobilized. All of this was compiled and passed upward, eventually reaching officials in Cusco, the capital. A day in their lives. What was daily life like for a Quipicamayak? Imagine him in a small Andean town, seated on a low stool, a bundle of cords in his lap. Farmers bring news of their harvest. He listens patiently, fingers running along strings, adding knots for sacks of maize, jars of chicha, or herds of llamas. His work is repetitive. He checks knots against spoken testimony, ties carefully, and sometimes unties mistakes. His fingers are nimble, calloused from fiber. His eyes scan colors and positions, recalling categories. He does not invent numbers. He preserves them. Later, he may travel to a storehouse, one of the empire's great kalkas built of stone on high slopes. He counts sacks, measures supplies, and ties more knots to match. Assistants carry the quipus. He repeats the process again and again, day after day. At home, he is an ordinary man, a farmer with a family, tending fields of maize or potatoes, raising guinea pigs for meat. But his status is higher than most villagers, for he carries the cords of the state. The nature of the work. It was boring and yet essential. Every knot had to be correct. A misplaced knot meant the wrong number, which meant miscounted grain or unpaid labor. In an empire that relied on redistribution rather than coinage, accuracy was survival. The work also demanded memory. Knots represented numbers, but categories and meanings were remembered orally. A red cord might represent warriors in one quipu, maize in another. The Quipicamayak had to know which was which, relying on training and tradition. Thus, their world was not just knots but recitation. They spoke aloud what each cord meant, repeating lists to apprentices, ensuring memory did not fade. The cords were anchors, but the voice gave them meaning. the empire they sustained. Through these cords, the Inca managed tribute from hundreds of communities. Roads, spanning thousands of miles, were maintained through labor recorded in knots. Armies were supplied with food drawn from storehouses whose inventories were tracked on quipus. The Quipucamaic rarely saw Cusco or the emperor, but his knots sustained them. He sat on a stool in a small town, fingers busy, while armies marched and emperors ruled. His life was repetitive, his role uncelebrated, but his cords held the empire's order together. The silence of history. Today, only a few hundred quipus survive. Many were destroyed after the Spanish conquest, when missionaries saw them as pagan tools. The voices of the Quipucamaics are gone. We know their titles, their duties, but not their names. They are remembered as a class, not as individuals. Yet their silence is itself meaningful. It shows us how empires rest on the unrecorded labor of ordinary men. Their knots, once vivid, are now mute, but once they carried the weight of millions of lives. So we picture him, a man in simple clothes, seated with cords, fingers tying knots while the wind sweeps through Andean valleys. His neighbors see him as an official, his superiors as a servant of empire. He himself may see only endless knots, endless repetition. But the question lingers. Did he know that his cords were the lifeline of an empire? Or did he think of himself only as a tired accountant, struggling to remember which cord meant maize and which meant llamas? You have seen the Quipucamaic seated on his stool, fingers busy with cords, recording harvests and storehouses. You have seen him in silence, preserving the empire's order through knots and memory. Now let us look more closely at how the system functioned in practice, how data flowed through the empire, and how these accountants lived with the burden of accuracy in a world without writing. The flow of information. The Inca Empire stretched across deserts, mountains, and valleys. To govern it, information had to travel. The Quipucamaic was the first link in this chain. He tied knots in a local village, recording tribute in maize, labor owed, or herds counted. Then, these cords were handed to couriers, chasquis, who ran along the empire's roads, carrying quipus and oral reports. The chasquis traveled in relays, sprinting from one station to the next. At each stop, the cords were passed on, the message repeated, the numbers confirmed. Within days, information from a remote Andean village could reach Cusco. There, higher officials examined the quipus, compared numbers, and made decisions about taxes, armies, or storehouse distributions. For this system to work, every link had to be accurate. If one Quipucamaic tied the wrong knot, or one courier misreported the oral part of the message, errors spread upward. The empire's stability rested on thousands of small acts of precision. The training of a knot keeper. The Quipucamaic was not an ordinary farmer chosen at random. He was trained, often from youth, to master knots and numbers. Apprenticeship meant long hours of practice, tying and untying cords, repeating categories aloud, memorizing the rules of placement and color. Some quipus were simple, showing a few numbers. Others were elaborate, with hundreds of cords and thousands of knots. Training required patience, discipline, and an eye for detail. The apprentice learned not only technique but also responsibility. Mistakes carried consequences. If a storehouse was miscounted, if tribute was short, blame fell on the Quipucamaic. Accuracy was not optional. It was survival. Daily encounters. A day's work was filled with encounters. Farmers brought their reports of harvests. Herdsmen reported flocks of llamas. Families declared their numbers for census counts. Each testimony became knots. The Quipucamaic listened carefully, fingers working, head nodding. He asked questions to clarify, compared answers with past records, tied knots in silence while the speaker waited. Then he repeated the totals aloud, confirming that cords matched words. These encounters were routine, but they carried weight. A miscount meant heavier burdens for some, lighter for others. Villagers depended on his fairness. Officials depended on his accuracy. He stood between community and empire, the texture of the work. To handle quipus was to live with texture. The cords were soft from spun fibers, sometimes rough, sometimes smooth. Colors varied, Red, yellow, green, brown, blue, each dyed with plants or minerals. Fingers moved along them constantly, counting knots, straightening strands, tying loops. The knots themselves had patterns. A single knot meant one. A long knot with multiple turns meant tens. Clusters marked hundreds or thousands. Fingers felt the difference even in dim light. Sight and touch worked together, guiding memory. The work left traces on the body. Fingertips grew calloused from constant knotting. Eyes strained from focusing on fine chords. Backs ached from sitting long hours in the same position. The silence of chords. Unlike alphabetic writing, quipus did not speak to outsiders. Only trained men could read them. To others, they looked like bundles of tangled strings. This gave the Quipukamaic power. He alone could interpret. His chords were silent to most, but full of meaning to him. This silence also made him vulnerable. Villagers might mistrust what he claimed a quipu said. Officials might doubt his accuracy. He lived under constant scrutiny, needing to prove that the chords matched reality. Trust was his most fragile possession. Corruption and pressure. As in any empire, corruption was possible. A Quipukamaic could underreport tribute, keeping some for himself or his village. He could tie knots in a way that favored local elites. But risk was high. Inspectors could arrive, compare quipus from different regions, and expose discrepancies. The empire depended on loyalty. Some Quipukamaics may have bent the rules, others may have been fiercely precise. Either way, pressure was constant. To serve the state meant balancing duty, community ties, and personal survival. The human cost. The life of a Quipukamaic was not glamorous. He spent hours tying cords, repeating numbers, checking knots. He traveled to storehouses, counted sacks, inspected animals. His hands were always busy, his mind always full of numbers. He may have felt pride, knowing he sustained an empire, but he may also have felt fatigue of endless repetition, of carrying cords that weighed less than a book but more than a life. His identity was bound to knots, and knots never ended. The broader view. Through these cords, the Inca built a system that impressed even their conquerors. Spanish chroniclers marveled that a people without writing could govern such a vast empire. They described quipus as writing with knots, unable to fully grasp how they worked. For the Inca, it was not strange. It was daily life. The Quipukamaic did what bureaucrats always do. Recorded, tallied, repeated. The difference was only in material, cords instead of paper, knots instead of ink. The boredom and the importance were the same. Closing question for Section 2. We have seen the flow of information, the training, the encounters, and the burdens of accuracy. Yet one question remains. Did the Quipukamaic see himself as the memory of the empire, or merely as a tired man tying endless knots? Did he understand that centuries later, people would marvel at his chords, or did he believe they would vanish like the voices that explained them? His knots remain, mute and mysterious, leaving us to wonder what it felt like to carry the empire's memory in strands of fiber. We have walked with the Quipukamaic as he tied knots in small villages, as he checked storehouses, and as his cords moved along the roads of the empire. We have seen the burden of precision, the silence of chords, and the human fatigue that came with endless repetition. Now we close his story, looking at the wider role of quipus in Inca governance, the fragility of a system built on memory and fiber, and the legacy of these accountants whose names were lost but whose knots remain. The web of the empire. The Inca Empire had no coinage. Wealth was measured not in minted metal but in goods, labor, and land. Tribute came in sacks of maize, rolls of cloth, herds of llamas, and days of work owed to the state. To manage this without written accounts, the empire needed constant record-keeping. Quipus were the empire's web. Each local knot-keeper tied records of harvest, tribute, and population. These cords traveled upward, checked by higher officials, then forwarded to Cusco. There, administrators compared quipus from across the empire, making decisions about redistribution. Where to send food in famine, how many men to draft for road building, how to supply armies on campaign. Without this web, the empire would have unraveled. Roads would have fallen into disrepair, armies gone hungry, and storehouses emptied. The emperor's orders were only as strong as the cords that recorded them. Ritual and authority. Quipus were not only tools of administration. They carried symbolic weight. When the Quipucamaic stood before villagers, cords in hand, he embodied the presence of the state. The knots were physical proof of obligation. To dispute them was to dispute the empire itself. In this sense, knots were ritual objects as much as practical ones. They reminded people of their ties, both literal and political, to the Inca system. Villagers may have viewed them with awe, suspicion, or resentment, but always with recognition of their authority. For the knot keeper, this authority was double-edged. He carried the empire's legitimacy, but also its weight. He was the one who told neighbors what they owed, not the emperor in Cusco. Their resentment often fell on him. The fragility of fiber. Cords were durable but not eternal. Moisture, insects, or fire could destroy them. To guard against loss, multiple copies of quipus were kept in different places. Inspectors compared cords to catch errors. Oral repetition served as backup, reinforcing knots with memory. Still, the fragility of fiber meant that the system depended on constant renewal. Knots had to be checked, retied, and replaced. The Quipucamaic's life was one of maintenance, of preventing decay as much as recording numbers. This fragility extended to the system itself. If memory slipped, if cords were lost, if corruption spread, the empire's accounts weakened. The Inca managed stability for decades, but their system always stood on precarious ground. Spanish eyes on quipus. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered quipus with confusion. Some saw them as primitive accounting tools. Others feared them as pagan scripts, dangerous because they preserved knowledge outside European forms. Missionaries destroyed many quipus, cutting cords and burning bundles. They sought to erase Inca memory, to replace cords with alphabetic writing. In this destruction, countless records vanished, censuses, tribute lists, storehouse inventories, perhaps even histories encoded in knots. For the Quipucamaic, conquest was more than political defeat. It was the loss of his profession, his authority, his purpose. The cords that had given his life meaning were rendered useless, his skills declared obsolete. The human silence. We do not know the names of most Quipucamaics. Their voices are silent, their stories unrecorded. All that remains are cords mute, stripped of their oral context. Archaeologists can count knots, identify colors, measure lengths, but without the voices that explain them, much remains mysterious. This silence is fitting. The Quipucamaic's life was one of repetition and anonymity even in his own time. He did not seek glory. His cords served others, not himself. History has preserved only his tools, not his words. The legacy of knots. Yet the legacy endures. The quipus that survive today are studied by scholars, revealing glimpses of Inca organization. They show the empire's sophistication, its ability to govern without writing. They remind us that bureaucracy need not be ink on paper, it can also be knots on fiber. The Quipucamaic's legacy is not in monuments or names, but in this proof of human adaptability. He showed that order can come from boredom, that empires can rest on the quiet labor of accountants tying knots in silence. Reflection for you. Picture him one last time. Seated on his stool, cords in hand, fingers busy, voice low as he recites categories to himself. Around him, farmers wait nervously, storehouses loom, mountains rise. He is one man in a vast empire, yet his knots carry weight greater than armies. Did he know that centuries later, his cords would be displayed in museums, studied by scholars, admired for their mystery? Or did he see only endless knots, endless numbers, endless obligations? The truth may be both. He was a man who tied knots, day after day, sustaining an empire through boredom. And in that boredom lay greatness. Closing thought. The Quipucamaic was not remembered by name, but his knots preserved an empire's memory. His life was not dramatic, but his cords were the backbone of order. His story reminds us that history rests not only on conquerors and builders, but also on quiet accountants, whose hands tied the strands that held societies together. So we end with a question. When history forgets the names but remembers the chords, whose story truly survives? The emperor who demanded tribute, or the anonymous accountant who tied the knot?